Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moment I stepped into the mall, I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. It was just another Saturday afternoon, the kind where you mindlessly wander through stores to kill time. But something in the air felt off, like the calm before a storm. If only I'd listened to that instinct, maybe I could have avoided the nightmare that was about to unfold. I'd come to the mall to return a sweater and maybe grab a coffee. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. The place was bustling with its usual weekend crowd. Families pushing strollers, teenagers huddled in giggling groups, elderly couples walking arm in arm. I weaved through the throngs of people, making my way to the department store at the far end of the mall. After returning the sweater, I decided to window shop for a bit. I wasn't in any hurry, and the air conditioning was a welcome respite from the sweltering heat outside. I meandered from store to store, occasionally trying on a shirt or examining a gadget I had no intention of buying. It was as I was leaving a bookstore that I first noticed him. A man, probably in his mid-30s, standing near a potted plant. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him. Average height, brown hair, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. But something about the way he was looking at me made me pause. It wasn't a casual glance. His eyes were fixed, intent. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. In a crowded mall, it's easy to imagine someone is looking at you when they're really not. I continued on my way, stopping at a few more stores. But every time I looked up, there he was. Always at a distance, always in my line of sight. Sometimes he'd be pretending to look at a store display. Other times he'd be sitting on a bench. But his eyes always found mine, and that same intense look was there. My heart started to beat faster. Was I imagining this? I decided to test it. I abruptly changed direction, cutting through a group of teenagers to head towards the food court. As I weaved through the tables, I glanced back. There he was, following the same path I had taken, his eyes never leaving me. Panic started to set in. This wasn't a coincidence. This man was following me. But why? What did he want? I picked up my pace, no longer pretending to shop. I needed to get out of there. I headed for the nearest exit, my steps quick but measured. I didn't want to run and cause a scene, but every instinct was screaming at me to flee. As I approached the doors, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of relief. Just a few more steps and I'd be out in the parking lot, safe in my car. But as I pushed against the door, my blood ran cold. It didn't budge. I pushed harder, then pulled, but it was locked tight. How was that possible? These were the main doors. They should have been open. I spun around looking for another way out. That's when I saw him again. Closer now, maybe 20 feet away. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He just stood there, watching me, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I ran. I didn't care about making a scene anymore. I sprinted towards the next set of doors, my heart pounding in my ears, but they too were locked. Impossible. This couldn't be happening. I looked around wildly, searching for a security guard, an employee, anyone who could help. But the mall suddenly seemed emptier than before. Where had all the people gone? Those who remained seemed oblivious to my distress, going about their shopping as if nothing was wrong. I spotted a young woman folding shirts in a nearby store. "Please," I gasped, running up to her. "I need help. There's a man following me, and the doors are locked. Can you call security?" She looked at me blankly. "I'm sorry. What doors are you talking about? All the exits are open." I stared at her in disbelief. "No, they're not. I just tried them. They're locked." She shook her head slowly. "Ma'am, I think you must be confused. The mall doesn't lock its doors during business hours. It's not possible." I wanted to scream. Why wouldn't she believe me? I turned to point out the man who had been following me, but he was gone. Had I imagined him too? "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just try the doors yourself. You'll see." The woman sighed but followed me to the nearest exit. I stood back, certain she'd find them locked just as I had. But to my horror, she pushed the door open effortlessly. "See? They're fine. Are you feeling all right? Do you need me to call someone for you?" I backed away from her, shaking my head. This couldn't be happening. Was I losing my mind? I mumbled an apology and hurried away, my mind reeling. As I rounded a corner, I nearly collided with him, the man who had been following me. He was standing there, blocking my path, that same unsettling smile on his face. "Having some trouble?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. I stumbled backward. "Stay away from me," I warned, though my voice shook. "I'll scream." He chuckled, taking a step closer. "Go ahead. No one will hear you. Or if they do, they won't care. Haven't you realized that by now?" I looked around frantically. He was right. The few people nearby seemed to look right through us, as if we weren't even there. "What's happening?" I whispered, fear clawing at my throat. "What do you want?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was a curious specimen. "What do I want?" That's an interesting question. What I want is for you to understand, to see the truth. "What truth?" I asked, backing away as he advanced. "That this," he gestured around us, "isn't real. None of it is. You're trapped. But not in the way you think." I shook my head, refusing to understand. "You're crazy. I'm leaving." I turned to run, but he was suddenly in front of me again, impossibly fast. "You can't leave," he said, almost gently. "You've been trying for hours, days even. Don't you remember?" And suddenly, I did. Flashes of memory hit me like a tidal wave. Me, running through the mall, trying door after door, the same conversations, the same people, over and over again. How long had I been here? "No," I whispered, sinking to my knees. "This isn't real. It can't be." He crouched down beside me. "But it is. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner we can move on." "Move on to what?" I asked, my voice hollow. His smile widened, and for a moment, I saw something inhuman flicker behind his eyes. "That's for you to decide. This is your prison, after all. Your mind created it. Only you can find the way out." I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to break free from whatever this was. When I opened them again, he was gone. But the mall remained, stretching out endlessly before me, a labyrinth of my own making. I stood up on shaky legs, looking around at the two bright lights, the two cheerful displays, the two oblivious people. It all seemed so normal, and yet so terribly wrong. As I started walking, no destination in mind, I realized the true horror of my situation. The man wasn't my enemy. He was the only real thing in this place, the only one telling me the truth. The real trap wasn't the locked doors or the endless corridors. It was my own mind, keeping me here, running in circles. I don't know how long I've been here now. Time seems to have lost all meaning. Sometimes I see him, watching me from a distance. Sometimes I try the doors again, hoping that this time they'll open. They never do. But I keep trying, because somewhere, somehow, there has to be a way out. And until I find it, I'm trapped in this never-ending nightmare. A prisoner in a mall of my own making, with no one but my shadow for company. The beam of my headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating a scene that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the desolate forest road, was a makeshift barricade, a jumble of logs, branches, and rocks haphazardly strewn across the asphalt. In that moment, as my tires screeched to a halt, I knew my quiet night drive had just taken a sinister turn. I'd been on the road for hours, making my way back from a weekend camping trip in the mountains. It was well past midnight, and the forest pressed in on both sides of the narrow road, a wall of impenetrable blackness beyond the reach of my headlights. I hadn't seen another car for miles. As I sat there, engine idling, I weighed my options. The smart thing would be to turn around, to find another route home. But the road was narrow, with steep embankments on either side. Attempting a U-turn in the dark seemed risky. Plus, I was low on gas. The next town was at least 30 miles ahead, and I wasn't sure I had enough fuel to backtrack to the last one I'd passed. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Perhaps a storm had blown some debris onto the road. It wouldn't be the first time I'd encountered something like this in these remote areas. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out of the car. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the low rumble of my engine and the crunch of gravel under my boots. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As I approached the barricade, the beam of my flashlight danced over the obstruction. It was worse up close. The logs were massive, far too heavy for me to move on my own. Smaller branches and rocks filled the gaps between them, creating a nearly impassable barrier. I circled the pile, looking for any way I might be able to clear a path. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft earth at the edge of the road. My breath caught in my throat. They were fresh, the edges still crisp and defined. I swung my flashlight towards the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me. But there was only darkness, the dense foliage swallowing up the light. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared in the vast silence. "Is anyone there?" No response, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the frantic beating of my own heart. I turned back to my car, walking faster now. I needed to get out of here, barricade or not. Staying put no longer felt like an option. As I reached for the door handle, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, just at the edge of my headlights, I saw a shadow dart between the trees. Panic surged through me. I yanked the door open and practically threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel. In my rearview mirror, I saw more movement, shapes emerging from the forest, dark silhouettes against the deeper blackness of the woods. They were coming towards the road, towards me. I didn't wait to see more. I gunned the engine, the car fishtailing as I executed a clumsy three-point turn. Branches scraped against the sides of my vehicle, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I straightened out and started to accelerate, my headlights swept across the road behind me. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of figures standing in the middle of the path. 3 or 4 of them, stock still, watching my retreat. Then they were gone, swallowed up by the night as I sped away. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What had I just seen? Who were those people? And what did they want? My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I drove for what felt like hours, taking random turns whenever I came to a fork in the road. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that barricade and the shadows that lurked behind it. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and I found myself on a wider, better-maintained road. Signs of civilization appeared, a gas station, then a few scattered houses. When I finally rolled into a small town, the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the eastern sky. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, killing the engine, but not getting out of the car. Now that the immediate danger had passed, doubt began to creep in. Had I overreacted? Maybe those shapes I'd seen were just deer or other wildlife. Maybe the footprints had been left by hikers earlier in the day. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The intentional placement of that barricade, the fresh footprints, the figures emerging from the woods, it all pointed to something far more sinister. I must have sat there for an hour, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, I worked up the courage to go into the diner. The warmth and light inside were a stark contrast to the dark forest I'd left behind. An older waitress with kind eyes asked if I was all right. I must have looked a mess, pale, shaken, with bits of leaves and twigs caught in my hair from the frantic drive. I ordered a coffee and tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded hollow and unbelievable even to my own ears. The waitress listened patiently, then told me about rumors she'd heard. Stories of people going missing on that stretch of road, of strange sightings in the forest. Most locals avoided driving through there at night, she said. As more patrons filtered into the diner and the sun climbed higher in the sky, the events of the night began to feel almost dreamlike. But the scratches on my car and the lingering fear in my gut were very real reminders of what I'd experienced. I called the local police to report what had happened. They took my statement but didn't seem particularly concerned. Probably just some kids playing pranks, they said. They'd send a patrol car out to check the area, but I could tell they didn't expect to find anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. Those figures on the road, the way they had emerged from the forest like they were lying in wait. It was clear their intentions weren't friendly. As I finally pulled out of the diner parking lot to continue my journey home, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd tried to clear that barricade. Would those shadowy figures have surrounded me? Would I have become another mysterious disappearance? Another story for locals to whisper about? I took the long way home, sticking to main roads and well-lit areas. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark car following me. But there was nothing, just the normal flow of daytime traffic. It's been weeks since that night, and I still haven't fully processed what happened. I've scoured local news sites and online forums, looking for any similar stories or reports of strange occurrences in that area. I've found a few vague accounts that echo parts of my experience, but nothing concrete. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself reliving those terrifying moments. The crunch of gravel under my feet as I approach the barricade, the flicker of movement in the tree line, the shadowy figures emerging from the darkness. I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of twigs snapping in my ears. I don't drive on remote forest roads anymore, especially not at night. The incident has left me with a deep-seated fear of dark, enclosed spaces, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed something that night, something that wasn't meant to be seen. Whatever was waiting for me on that lonely stretch of road, I'm certain of one thing: it wasn't human, at least not in any way that matters. And I can't help but wonder how many others have encountered that barricade, those footprints, those shadowy figures. How many weren't as lucky as I was? The forest holds its secrets close, and some things are better left undiscovered. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about those dark figures. And I wonder if, somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, they're thinking about me too. The silence was deafening. In all my years of hiking, I'd never experienced a forest this quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. Just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Little did I know, this unsettling quiet was just the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. I'd been on the trail for 3 days, enjoying the solitude and the chance to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and my relationship had just ended. This solo hiking trip was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, I started looking for a good spot to set up camp for the night. I found a small clearing just off the main trail, sheltered by a cluster of tall pines. Perfect. I quickly went about my routine, pitching my tent, gathering firewood, and setting up my cooking gear. With camp established, I decided to explore the immediate area before it got too dark. That's when I first noticed it. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't unusual to see cairns on hiking trails, but this one seemed out of place. I didn't remember seeing it when I first entered the clearing. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. I'd been hiking all day, after all. I returned to my campsite, cooked a simple dinner, and settled in for the night. Sleep came easily after a long day on the trail, but sometime in the middle of the night, I jolted awake. Something had woken me, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I lay still, listening intently. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on leaves, circling my tent. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon looking for food. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. Should I call out? Should I unzip the tent and look? The footsteps continued their slow, methodical circuit around my campsite. Gathering my courage, I spoke, my voice sounding thin and weak in the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying than the sound had been. I held my breath, straining my ears for any noise, any indication of what was out there. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from my tent and fading into the distance. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been clutching my flashlight so tightly my hand hurt. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, every muscle tense, jumping at every little sound. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the walls of my tent, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it through the night. As soon as it was light enough, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, half expecting to see some sign of my nocturnal visitor, but everything looked normal. My backpack was where I'd left it. Nothing seemed disturbed. Then I saw it, and my blood ran cold. There, at the edge of my campsite, was another pile of rocks. This one was larger than the first. The stones balanced precariously on top of each other. I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there the night before. My mind raced. Who had built it? When? Was it the same person who had been walking around my tent in the night? I approached the cairn cautiously, as if it might suddenly come to life. Up close, I could see that some of the rocks had strange markings on them, symbols I didn't recognize scratched into the surface. I backed away, my heart pounding. Something was very wrong here. I needed to leave, to get back to the main trail and civilization as quickly as possible. I turned back to my tent, intent on packing up and getting out of there. That's when I saw the third cairn. It was on the opposite side of my campsite, mirroring the position of the second one. I froze, my eyes darting around the clearing. How had I not noticed it before? Had it just appeared? The thought made me dizzy with fear. I rushed to break down my camp, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the tent poles. Every few seconds, I'd glance up, half expecting to see more rock piles appearing around me. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just yesterday now felt oppressive and threatening. As I stuffed the last of my gear into my backpack, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. There, just inside the tree line, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, dark and indistinct, ducking behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. No response, just the unnatural silence of the forest pressing in around me. I shouldered my pack, no longer caring if I'd forgotten anything. I just needed to get out of there. As I turned to leave, my foot kicked something. I looked down and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. There, half buried in the leaves, was a small rock with the same strange symbols etched into its surface. I ran. I didn't care about following the trail or pacing myself. Pure adrenaline and fear propelled me forward, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear movement in the forest around me, catching occasional glimpses of shadowy figures flitting between the trees. Were they chasing me? Hurting me? I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to find out. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I fled through the woods. My lungs burned, My legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, mercifully, I burst out of the tree line and onto a paved road. I nearly cried with relief at the sight of it. A car was approaching. I waved my arms frantically, probably looking like a madman. The car slowed, and an older couple peered at me with concern. I babbled out my story, the rock piles, the footsteps, the shadowy figures. They exchanged a look I couldn't quite read, but they let me into their car and drove me to the nearest town. I went to the police, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They took my statement, said they'd look into it, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. I couldn't blame them. It sounded crazy even to my own ears. I never went back to those woods. I couldn't bring myself to, even when the police said they'd found nothing unusual in the area I'd described. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, and every time I see a pile of rocks, no matter how innocuous, I can't help but shudder. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know who or what was out there. But I do know one thing. Sometimes, the wilderness holds secrets darker and more terrifying than we can imagine, and sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, revealing a sight that turned my blood to ice. There, etched into the dirt just inches from where I'd been sleeping, was a crude symbol I'd never seen before. In that moment, as the realization dawned that someone, or something, had been in my campsite while I slept, I knew my solitary hiking trip had taken a terrifying turn. I'd set out on this adventure 3 days ago, eager to escape the chaos of city life and find some peace in the wilderness. The trail I'd chosen was remote, winding through dense forests and along crystal-clear streams. I'd seen more wildlife than people, which was exactly what I'd wanted. The first 2 nights had been uneventful. I'd fallen into a comfortable routine, hiking during the day, setting up camp in the evening, and falling asleep to the soothing sounds of nature. But as I stared at that symbol, my sense of tranquility shattered like glass. My hands shook as I fumbled for my camera, snapping a quick picture of the marking. It was a circle with a jagged line running through it, carved deep into the soil. The edges were crisp, the dirt still damp. This was fresh. I scrambled out of my tent, my eyes darting around the campsite. Everything else seemed untouched. My backpack was where I'd left it, propped against a tree. The remains of last night's fire were undisturbed, but the feeling of violation, of intrusion, hung heavy in the air. As I circled my tent, I noticed something else that made my heart skip a beat. Footprints. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was all wrong, and they were larger. They appeared from the edge of the clearing, circled my tent, and then disappeared back into the underbrush. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker had stumbled upon my camp in the night, decided not to disturb me, and left. But why the symbol? And why no other signs of their presence? My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. I thought about the stories I'd heard, tales of strange cults operating in remote areas, of people going missing in national parks. I'd always dismissed them as urban legends, but standing there, staring at that eerie symbol, those stories suddenly felt all too real. I needed to leave. Now. I started packing up my gear, my movements frantic and clumsy. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just yesterday now felt oppressive and threatening. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. Words in a language I didn't recognize, coming from the trees behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned around. At first I saw nothing but the dense foliage. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something shifted in the shadows, just beyond the clearing. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. For a split second, I saw a face, pale, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Then it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. Panic overtook me. I abandoned the rest of my packing, grabbing only my backpack and water bottle. I had to get out of there. I didn't even bother trying to find the trail. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear movement behind me, the sound of pursuit. Whispers echoed through the trees, sometimes sounding like they were right next to me, other times distant. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was terrified of what I might see. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning as pure adrenaline and fear propelled me forward. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Eventually, I burst out of the tree line and onto a dirt road. I nearly cried with relief at the sight of it. A pickup truck was approaching. I waved my arms frantically, probably looking like a madman. The truck slowed, and an older man leaned out the window, eyeing me warily. "You all right, son?" he asked, taking in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. I babbled out my story, the symbol, the footprints, the whispers in the woods. The man's expression shifted from concern to something like understanding. "Get in," he said, unlocking the passenger door. "You're not the first to come out of those woods with a story like that." As we drove, he told me about the local legends, stories of an ancient cult that still practiced in the deep woods, of hikers and campers who ventured too far off the beaten path and were never seen again. He'd never believed them himself, he said, but he'd lived in the area long enough to know there was something out there that defied explanation. We reached the nearest town, and the man dropped me off at the local police station. The officers took my statement, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They said they'd look into it, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had been out there in those woods, it wasn't something that would leave evidence for the authorities to find. I gave them the memory card from my camera, with the picture of the symbol. They said they'd run it through their database, see if it matched any known cult activity, but somehow, I knew it wouldn't. This was something older, something that predated our modern understanding of the world. I spent that night in a motel, jumping at every sound, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the morning, I bought a bus ticket back to the city. I couldn't bear the thought of getting back in a car and driving through those forests again. As the bus pulled away from the small town, I watched the tree line recede in the distance. A part of me felt relief, but another part felt like I was running away from something unfinished, like whatever was out there in those woods wasn't done with me yet. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I threw myself into work, spent time with friends, did everything I could to forget about that symbol in the dirt and the whispers in the trees. But it haunted me. In my dreams, I found myself back in that clearing, surrounded by pale faces with dark, empty eyes, their whispers growing louder until they became a deafening roar. I researched obsessively, looking for any information about cults or strange occurrences in that area. I found a few vague stories, accounts from other hikers who'd had unsettling experiences in those woods, but nothing concrete, nothing that fully explained what I'd encountered. The police never found anything. They said they'd done a sweep of the area but found no evidence of any camp or cult activity. The symbol I'd photographed didn't match any known group. Eventually, they closed the case, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or maybe a prank by local kids. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. There's something out there in those woods, something ancient and unknowable. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling me back to the forest. I don't go hiking anymore. The thought of being alone in the wilderness fills me with a deep, primal fear. But a part of me knows that one day, I'll have to go back, to face whatever it was that left that symbol. to uncover the truth behind those whispers in the dark. Until then, I live with the knowledge that there are things in this world that defy explanation, forces that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. And I wonder how many others have encountered them, have seen the symbols and heard the whispers, but were never able to tell their stories. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrible. And sometimes, when we venture into the unknown, we stumble upon truths that were never meant to be discovered. My encounter in those woods changed me forever, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease and a desperate need to understand. But some mysteries, I've come to realize, are better left unsolved. The first red flag should have been the way Roger's smile never quite reached his eyes, but I was too captivated by the rustic charm of the cabin, too eager for a peaceful getaway, to notice the predatory glint lurking beneath his friendly demeanor. It wasn't until I discovered the hidden cameras that I realized I'd walked straight into a nightmare of my own making. I'd found the cabin on one of those vacation rental websites. The photos showcased a cozy interior, all warm wood and plush furnishings, nestled in a picturesque forest setting. It seemed perfect for a week-long escape from my hectic city life. The price was surprisingly reasonable, which should have been my second warning sign. But I was too busy fantasizing about quiet evenings by the fireplace and lazy mornings, sipping coffee on the porch, to question my good fortune. Roger, the owner, met me at the cabin on the day of my arrival. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands that spoke of a life spent working outdoors. His welcome was warm, if a bit overbearing. "You're going to love it here," he said, helping me with my bags. "It's so peaceful, you'll never want to leave." I laughed politely, not realizing how ominous those words would soon become. Roger gave me a tour of the cabin, pointing out the amenities and quirks of the old building. He was particularly insistent about showing me the impressive security system. "Can't be too careful out here in the woods," he said with a wink. "But don't worry, you're safe as houses." I nodded, appreciating his concern for my safety. If only I'd known then that the real danger was already inside the cabin with me. After Roger left, I spent the rest of the day settling in. I unpacked, explored the nearby trails, and ended the evening with a glass of wine on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was exactly the escape I'd been longing for. The first couple of days passed in a blissful blur of hikes, reading, and relaxation, but on the third night, things took a turn for the unsettling. I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty and disoriented. As I stumbled to the kitchen for a glass of water, I could have sworn I heard footsteps overhead. I froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. I chalked it up to the house settling, or my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. The next morning, I noticed small things out of place. A book I was sure I'd left on the coffee table was now on the shelf. The throw blanket on the couch was folded differently. Nothing major, nothing I could definitively say wasn't my own doing, but enough to plant a seed of unease in my mind. That afternoon, Roger showed up unannounced, claiming he was just checking in to make sure everything was to my liking. His visit felt invasive, his questions too personal. He wanted to know about my job, my family, whether I was seeing anyone. I answered vaguely, trying to be polite while maintaining some boundaries. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. "You know," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intense, "I've got spare keys. If you ever lock yourself out, just give me a call. I'm always around." The idea of Roger having unrestricted access to the cabin while I was staying there made me deeply uncomfortable. That night, I double-checked all the locks before going to bed. The next day, I decided to do some work on my laptop. As I was setting up at the dining table, I noticed a small black dot in the corner of the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just a spot on the wood, but something about it nagged at me. I grabbed a chair to take a closer look, and my blood ran cold. It was a camera, tiny and well hidden, but unmistakably there. My heart racing, I began a frantic search of the cabin. I found another camera above the front door, one in the kitchen, and to my horror, one in the bedroom, positioned right above the bed. The realization that I had been watched, that my most private moments had been invaded, made me physically ill. I sat on the couch, shaking, trying to process what I'd discovered. Who had put the cameras there? Roger was the obvious suspect, but I couldn't be sure. And what should I do now? Call the police. But I was miles from anywhere, and who knew how long it would take them to arrive? As I was deliberating my next move, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Peering through the window, I saw Roger's truck pulling up. Panic surged through me. Did he know I'd found the cameras? Was he coming to confront me? I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, only to discover there was no signal. Of course, how convenient. There was a knock at the door. "Hello?" Roger called out. "Just thought I'd stop by and see how you're settling in." I didn't answer, hoping he'd think I was out on a hike and leave. But then I heard the jingle of keys. He was coming in. I raced to the bedroom, looking for a place to hide. The closet was too obvious. Under the bed. No, too exposed. My eyes fell on the window. It was my only chance. I had just managed to slide it open when I heard the front door creak open. "Hello?" Roger called again, his voice closer now. "Are you here?" As quietly as I could, I climbed out the window. My feet had just touched the ground when I heard footsteps in the bedroom. I took off running into the woods, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and until I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own heart. Finally, I stopped, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. I had no idea where I was, no phone, no supplies, but I knew I couldn't go back to the cabin. As the initial panic subsided, I tried to think rationally. I needed to find help, to get to a road or another cabin, but which way should I go? That's when I heard it. A voice calling my name, distant but clear. Roger. He was looking for me. Fear gave me a fresh burst of energy, and I started running again. I had no plan, no direction, just the desperate need to put as much distance between myself and Roger as possible. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the dense forest, but eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Hope surged through me. Where there was a road, there had to be people. I followed the road, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw lights in the distance. A gas station. I burst into the store, startling the sleepy-looking clerk behind the counter. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. I need to call the police." The clerk, to his credit, didn't ask questions. He handed me his phone, and I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The next few hours passed in a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and went to investigate the cabin. They found the cameras, just as I'd described. Roger was nowhere to be found, but his truck was still parked outside. As I sat in the back of a police car, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, an officer approached me. "Ma'am," he said, his face grim, "we found something you need to see." He led me to a police van and opened the back doors. Inside were dozens of screens, each showing a different view of the cabin. It wasn't just my stay that had been recorded. There were months, maybe years of footage. "We think he's been doing this for a long time," the officer said softly. "You're not the first, but thanks to you, you might be the last." The relief of escape was tempered by the horror of what could have happened, of what had likely happened to others before me. As I was driven away from the forest, away from the cabin and its hidden horrors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided a fate too terrible to contemplate. In the weeks and months that followed, as the investigation unfolded and more victims were identified, I struggled to come to terms with my experience. The trust I'd once had in the kindness of strangers, in the safety of a rustic getaway, was shattered. Roger was eventually caught and brought to justice, but the damage was done. I still have nightmares about those hidden cameras, about being watched without knowing it. I can't stay in hotels or vacation rentals anymore without obsessively checking for hidden devices. But I survived. I got out. And in sharing my story, I hope to warn others about the dangers that can lurk behind friendly smiles and rustic charm. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for their chance to pounce. The moment I realized we were lost, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The dense forest that had seemed so inviting just hours ago now loomed ominously around us, and the friendly faces of our impromptu guides had taken on a sinister cast. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a terrible mistake in trusting these strangers. It had started innocently enough. My best friend Emily and I had been planning this hiking trip for months. We'd mapped out a route through a beautiful, if remote, stretch of wilderness, packed our gear meticulously, and set out early that morning with high spirits and a sense of adventure. The first few hours of our hike were everything we'd hoped for. The trail wound through lush forest and along babbling streams, with breathtaking vistas at every turn. We stopped often to take photos and marvel at the unspoiled beauty of nature. It was around midday when we encountered the group. 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, all in their 30s or 40s, were resting at a small clearing just off the trail. They waved as we approached, and we struck up a friendly conversation. They introduced themselves as locals who often hiked in the area. Ray, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard, seemed to be the unofficial leader of the group. He asked about our plans, nodding thoughtfully as we described our intended route. "You know," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "There's a spot not far from here that's even more beautiful than where you're headed. It's a bit off the main trail, but the view is absolutely worth it. Most tourists miss it entirely." Emily's eyes lit up at the suggestion. She'd always been the more adventurous one, always eager to explore off the beaten path. I, on the other hand, felt a twinge of unease. We'd planned our route carefully, and veering off course hadn't been part of the plan. But as the others chimed in, describing the hidden waterfall and the panoramic view of the valley, my reservations began to waver. They seemed so genuine in their enthusiasm, so eager to share this local secret with us. "It's not far," Ray assured us. "We'd be happy to show you the way. It'd be a shame for you to come all this way and miss the best part of the forest." Emily turned to me, her expression pleading. "Come on, it'll be fun. When are we going to get another chance like this?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. We'd come this far, after all. What harm could there be in a small detour? As we set off, following our new guides into the denser part of the forest, I tried to shake off my lingering doubts. They were just being friendly, I told myself. Locals often like to share their favorite spots with tourists. But as the hours wore on and the Kargan short detour stretched into a lengthy trek, my unease returned with a vengeance. The trail had long since disappeared, and we were now pushing through thick underbrush. The friendly chatter that had filled the air earlier had dwindled to an uncomfortable silence. I checked my phone, hoping to pull up our GPS location, but there was no signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest cell tower. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. Ray glanced back at me, that same slow smile on his face. "Not far now. You'll see. It'll be worth it." But something in his tone made my skin crawl. I caught Emily's eye, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face too. As the light began to fade, casting long shadows through the trees, panic started to set in. We were lost, deep in unfamiliar territory, with 4 strangers who suddenly didn't seem so friendly anymore. I pulled Emily aside while the others were distracted, supposedly checking the route. We need to get out of here, I whispered urgently. Something's not right. She nodded, her earlier excitement replaced by fear. But how? We don't know where we are, and it's getting dark. Before I could respond, Ray approached us. "Everything okay, ladies?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Actually," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "we're getting a bit tired. Maybe we should head back and try for the waterfall another day." Ray's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Oh, but we're so close now. It'd be a shame to turn back. Why don't we set up camp for the night? We can reach the spot in the morning." The others had gathered around us now, forming a loose circle. I felt trapped, my heart racing. This wasn't a friendly hike anymore. This was something else entirely. "No, thank you," Emily said firmly, seeming to have found her courage. "We'd like to go back now." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The pretense of friendliness dropped away, replaced by something menacing. Ray's smile twisted into a sneer. "I'm afraid that's not an option," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You see, you're our guests now, and we have plans for you." Terror surged through me. In that moment, I knew we had to run. It was our only chance. I grabbed Emily's hand and bolted, pushing past the startled group. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. We ran blindly, with no idea where we were going. The forest was almost completely dark now, and more than once we nearly ran headlong into trees. But fear and adrenaline kept us going. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we stumbled into a small ravine. Gasping for breath, we huddled under an overhanging rock, straining our ears for any sound of our pursuers. For a long moment, all we could hear was our own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of our hearts. Then, distantly, came the sound of voices calling to each other. They were still looking for us. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly despite the panic clouding my mind. "We need to keep moving, find a road, or a town, or anything." We set off again, moving as quietly as we could while still covering ground. The darkness was almost complete now, the thick canopy overhead blocking out even the starlight. We stumbled more than walked, using our hands to feel our way forward. The voices behind us grew fainter, then louder again. They were quartering the area, methodically searching. More than once, we froze in terror as flashlight beams swept nearby, certain we were about to be discovered. I lost all sense of time. We could have been moving for hours or mere minutes. My world narrowed to the feel of Emily's hand in mine, the sound of our careful footsteps, and the constant gnawing fear of being found. Then, miraculously, we saw a light ahead. Not the roving beam of a flashlight, but a steady glow. As we drew closer, we realized it was a cabin. For a moment, hope surged through me. Then doubt crept in. What if this was their destination all along? What if we'd walked right into their trap? But we were out of options. We were exhausted, lost, and it was only a matter of time before our pursuers found us. We had to take the risk. We approached the cabin cautiously. Through a window, we could see an elderly couple sitting by a fire, reading. They looked so normal, so safe, that I almost cried with relief. We knocked on the door, our hearts in our throats. The old man who answered looked startled to see two disheveled, terrified young women on his doorstep in the middle of the night. But when we managed to stammer out our story, his face darkened with concern and anger. "Come in, quickly," he said, ushering us inside. His wife was already on the phone, calling the local sheriff. As we sat huddled under blankets, sipping hot tea and waiting for the police to arrive, the old couple told us about rumors they'd heard. Stories of hikers going missing in these woods, of a group that preyed on unsuspecting tourists. They'd always dismissed them as campfire tales, but now, the sheriff arrived with several deputies. They took our statements and organized a search of the area, but they found no trace of Ray or the others. It was as if they'd vanished into the forest. In the days and weeks that followed, as the investigation unfolded, we learned more about the group that had lured us into the woods. There had been other victims, some who'd escaped like us, others who hadn't been so lucky. The forest, it seemed, held darker secrets than we could have imagined. Emily and I never went hiking again. The experience left us with scars that went deeper than the scratches from our frantic flight through the woods. But we survived. We got away. And in sharing our story, we hope to warn others about the dangers that can lurk behind friendly smiles and offers of local knowledge. Because sometimes, the most beautiful places hide the ugliest truths, and not everyone who offers to guide you has your best interests at heart. The sound of my car tires being slashed was the moment I knew this Airbnb stay had become a waking nightmare. It was a sharp, unmistakable hiss that cut through the still night air, shattering any illusions I had about the safety of this quaint suburban home. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just a guest here. I was a prisoner. It had all started innocently enough. I'd booked the Airbnb for a week-long work trip, drawn in by the charming photos of a cozy bungalow and the host's glowing reviews. Roger, the owner, had been nothing but accommodating in our messages, answering all my questions promptly and even offering to stock the fridge with some basics before my arrival. When I pulled up to the house that first evening, I was pleasantly surprised. It looked even better than the photos. A quaint little home with a well-manicured lawn and cheerful flower boxes in the windows. Roger was waiting on the porch, a tall, lean man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile. "Welcome," he called out as I got out of my car. "Let me help you with those bags." He was the picture of hospitality as he showed me around the house, pointing out all the amenities and giving me tips about the neighborhood. If anything, he seemed almost too eager to please, but I chalked it up to him being an attentive host. "Now, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let me know," he said as he was leaving. "I live just next door, so I'm always around." I thanked him and settled in for the night, looking forward to a productive week of remote work in this peaceful setting. The first couple of days were uneventful. I'd work during the day, take walks around the neighborhood in the evening, and enjoy the quiet of the house at night. But on the third day, things started to feel off. I woke up to find the kitchen had been tidied. Dishes I'd left in the sink were cleaned and put away, the counters wiped down. At first, I thought maybe I'd done it myself and forgotten, but then I noticed other small changes. Books on the shelf rearranged, my laptop moved from where I'd left it on the coffee table to the desk in the bedroom. A chill ran down my spine as I realized someone had been in the house while I slept. I immediately thought of Roger and his eager-to-please attitude. Had he come in to tidy up without asking? The idea made me deeply uncomfortable. I decided to confront him about it. When I knocked on his door, he answered with that same warm smile. But there was something different in his eyes, a glint of something I couldn't quite place. "Roger, has anyone been in the house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I noticed some things moved around. His smile never wavered. "Oh, I hope you don't mind. I like to keep things tidy for my guests. I have a spare key, you see. I should have mentioned it." I forced a smile, but inside, my stomach was churning. "I appreciate the thought, but I'd prefer if you didn't come in without asking. Privacy and all that, you know." Of course," he nodded, still smiling. "Won't happen again." But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of his expression changing, just for a second. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and hard. That night, I double-checked all the locks before going to bed. I even wedged a chair under the doorknob, feeling slightly ridiculous but unable to shake my unease. The next morning, I woke to find the chair moved and the kitchen tidied again. Panic started to set in. This wasn't just an overzealous host. This was something much more sinister. I decided then and there that I needed to leave. Work be damned. I didn't feel safe here anymore. I started packing my bags, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes haphazardly into my suitcase. That's when I heard a knock at the door. "Everything all right in there?" Roger's voice called out. "I saw you moving around a lot, just wanted to check if you needed anything." My blood ran cold. How long had he been watching me? "I'm fine," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just doing some reorganizing." "All right then," he replied, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Let me know if you need any help." I heard his footsteps retreating, but I didn't relax. I knew I needed to get out of there, and fast. As soon as I finished packing, I grabbed my bags and headed for the door. But when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The lock had been changed. Panic surged through me. I ran to the windows, but they were all locked too, the kind that needed a key to open from the inside. I was trapped. I pulled out my phone, ready to call the police, but there was no signal. Of course, how convenient. That's when I heard it, the hiss of air escaping tires. I ran to the window and saw Roger, kneeling beside my car, a knife in his hand as he methodically slashed each tire. He must have heard me at the window because he looked up, that same warm smile on his face, but his eyes were cold and empty. "Going somewhere," he called out, his voice cheerful, but with an undercurrent of menace. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, you're special, not like the others. You're going to stay here with me." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The others. How many people had he done this to? I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I needed to find a way out, but every exit was blocked. I was trapped in a house that had transformed from a cozy retreat into a prison. As I heard Roger's key in the lock, I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the bedside table and positioned myself behind the door. As it swung open, I swung the lamp with all my might. There was a sickening thud as it connected with Roger's head. He crumpled to the floor, stunned, but not unconscious. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I leapt over his prone form and ran. The street was quiet, eerily so. No cars, no pedestrians, just rows of identical houses with manicured lawns. I ran, my bare feet slapping against the pavement, my lungs burning. I could hear Roger behind me, shouting, "You can't leave. You're mine now. You're all mine." His words spurred me on, fear giving me a burst of speed I didn't know I possessed. I ran until the houses gave way to shops, until I saw people, normal people going about their day. I burst into the first open store I saw, gasping for breath, probably looking like a madwoman. "Please," I managed to choke out. "Call the police. Someone's after me." The store clerk, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He locked the door and called 911 while a kind-faced woman guided me to a chair and offered me water. When the police arrived, I told them everything. About Roger, about the locked doors and slashed tires, about the others he had mentioned. They listened gravely, exchanging looks I couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't until later, at the station, that I learned the full horrifying truth. Roger had been doing this for years. The house next door wasn't his. It belonged to a couple who'd been on vacation for months. There were other houses too, all Airbnbs, all traps for unsuspecting guests. They found evidence of at least a dozen victims. Some had managed to escape, like me. Others, well, the investigation was ongoing. As I sat there, wrapped in a scratchy blanket and sipping bad coffee, I couldn't stop shaking. Not just from the fear and adrenaline, but from the realization of how close I'd come to becoming another statistic, another missing person whose fate would remain a mystery. In the days and weeks that followed, as the full scope of Roger's crimes came to light, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The trust I'd once had in the kindness of strangers, in the safety of a home away from home, was shattered, but I survived. I got out, and in sharing my story, I hope to warn others about the dangers that can lurk behind friendly smiles and glowing reviews. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who make you feel safe right up until the moment they reveal their true nature. The Airbnb listing for that quaint bungalow is gone now, but I know there are others out there, other Rogers, waiting for their next victim. And all I can do is hope that my story might save someone else from falling into the same trap I did. The headlights appeared in my rearview mirror like twin specters, materializing out of the inky darkness of the deserted highway. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another late-night traveler heading home. But as the miles stretched on and those lights remained fixed behind me, a creeping sense of unease began to take hold. Little did I know, this seemingly ordinary drive was about to become the most terrifying night of my life. I'd been on the road for hours, making my way back from a business trip upstate. It was well past midnight, and the highway stretched out before me, empty and endless. The monotony of the drive had lulled me into a sort of trance, my mind wandering as my hands guided the wheel on autopilot. The appearance of another car should have been a welcome break from the solitude. Instead, it set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the way the car seemed to materialize out of nowhere, but something about it felt off from the start. At first, I tried to rationalize my unease. It was a highway, after all. Cars were bound to be going in the same direction for long stretches. But as I watched the headlights in my mirror, never growing closer or falling behind, always maintaining that same, precise distance, the hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up. I decided to test my theory. I eased my foot off the gas, letting my speed drop from 70 to 60. The car behind me slowed too, matching my pace exactly. My heart rate picked up. This could still be a coincidence, I told myself. Maybe they were using me as a guide for their speed, a common enough practice on dark highways. But I had to be sure. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my speed up to 80. The car behind me surged forward, closing the gap slightly before settling back into that same, unchanging distance. Now my palms were sweating on the steering wheel. This was no coincidence. Whoever was behind me was deliberately matching my every move. I tried to get a look at the driver in my mirrors, but all I could see were those glaring headlights. The car itself was nondescript, a dark sedan, its details lost in the night. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of highway patrol? But why wouldn't they just pull me over if I'd done something wrong? Was it a drunk driver, using me as a guide to stay on the road? Or was it something more sinister? I checked my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. The next exit was coming up in a few miles. I decided I'd take it, find a populated area, maybe a 24-hour gas station where I could safely stop and figure out what to do. As I approached the exit, I slowed down and put on my turn signal. The car behind me mimicked my actions perfectly. My heart sank. They were definitely following me. At the last second, I made a decision. Instead of taking the exit, I swerved back onto the highway. The car behind me reaction was instant, smoothly following my maneuver as if they'd anticipated it. Now I was truly afraid. This was no random occurrence. Whoever was behind me was hunting me, for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. I pressed down hard on the accelerator, pushing my car to speeds I'd never dared before. The engine whined in protest as the needle climbed past 90, 100, 110. But no matter how fast I went, those headlights stayed with me, neither gaining nor losing ground. My hands were shaking on the wheel now, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't keep this up forever. Eventually, I'd run out of gas, or lose control on a turn. I needed another plan. Up ahead, I saw a sign for a rest area. It wasn't ideal. These places were often deserted at night. But it was my best chance. Maybe there would be other people there, or at least some lights and cameras that might deter my pursuer. I took the exit at the last possible moment, tires squealing as I swerved onto the off-ramp. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd lost control, but somehow I managed to keep the car on the road. The rest area was dark and empty, just as I'd feared. A few sodium lights cast a sickly yellow glow over the parking lot, but there wasn't another soul in sight. I screeched to a stop near the main building, leapt out of my car, and ran for the door. It was locked. Of course it was locked. What rest stop stays open at 2 a.m.? I turned back to my car, ready to make another run for it, but froze in my tracks. The other car had pulled in behind me, blocking my exit. Its engine was still running, headlights blazing, but I still couldn't make out anything about the driver. For a long moment, we were at a stalemate. Me, standing exposed in the harsh glare of the headlights, and them, safely ensconced in their vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, slowly, the driver's side door opened. I didn't wait to see who would emerge. I turned and ran, heading for the wooded area behind the rest stop. I could hear footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried, as if my pursuer knew they'd catch me eventually. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But fear gave me speed and agility I never knew I possessed. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the trees and onto another road. It was smaller than the highway, probably a local route, but at that moment it looked like salvation. I started jogging along the shoulder, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Then, in the distance, I heard it. The low rumble of an engine, growing steadily louder. Headlights appeared around a bend in the road, heading in my direction. For a moment, hope surged through me. Maybe this was help, a chance at rescue. But as the vehicle drew closer, that hope turned to ash in my mouth. It was the same car. Somehow, they had found me again. I dove off the road, tumbling down a small embankment and into a ditch. I lay there, barely daring to breathe, as the car slowed to a crawl above me. For what felt like an eternity, all I could hear was the idle of the engine. Then, suddenly, it revved, and the car sped away. I waited, counting to 100, then 200, before I dared to move. Slowly, I crawled up the embankment and peered over the edge. The road was empty in both directions. Exhausted, terrified, but alive, I started walking. I didn't know where I was or where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not until I found help, or until the sun came up and chased away the terrors of this endless night. It was nearly dawn when I finally stumbled into a small town. The first open place I found was a diner, just opening for the breakfast crowd. The waitress took one look at my disheveled, wild-eyed appearance and immediately called the police. I told them everything, about the car following me, the chase, the rest stop. They listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Without any evidence, it all sounded like the paranoid fantasy of an overtired driver. They drove me back to the rest stop to retrieve my car. It was there, untouched, exactly where I'd left it. There was no sign that anything out of the ordinary had happened. In the harsh light of day, I almost could have believed I'd imagined it all. Almost. But the scratches on my arms from the branches, the mud on my clothes, and the bone-deep terror that still gripped me were all too real. I never found out who was in that car, or why they chased me. The police investigation turned up nothing. No other reports of similar incidents, no suspicious vehicles in the area. It was as if my pursuer had vanished into the night, leaving no trace but the fear that still haunts me. I don't drive at night anymore, especially not on lonely highways. The memory of those headlights in my rearview mirror, always there, never wavering, is enough to keep me home after dark. Because now I know that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes they're right behind you on an empty road, just waiting for their chance to strike. The clearing appeared like a mirage in the dense forest, a perfect circle of sunlight cutting through the gloom. In that moment of discovery, I felt a surge of relief. Little did I know that stepping into that sun-dappled space would be the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I'd been hiking for hours, having strayed from the main trail in search of a more challenging route. It was something I'd done countless times before, confident in my abilities and the reliability of my GPS. But as the day wore on and unfamiliar terrain stretched out in every direction, I had to admit an uncomfortable truth. I was lost. The realization had just begun to sink in when I stumbled upon the clearing. It was beautiful, almost otherworldly. Wildflowers dotted the lush grass, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of pine. After hours of trudging through the shadowy undergrowth, it felt like I'd discovered a hidden paradise. As I stepped into the open space, I noticed a group of people gathered near the center. 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, all casually dressed in hiking gear. They turned to look at me as I approached, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone who could point me in the right direction. "Hello," I called out, raising a hand in greeting. "I hate to bother you, but I think I've gotten a bit turned around. Could you tell me how to get back to the main trail?" The group exchanged glances, a series of unspoken communications passing between them. Then one of the men, tall with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "Of course," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "We'd be happy to help. I'm John, by the way. This is Sarah, Mike, and Lisa." He gestured to his companions, who all nodded in greeting. I introduced myself, explaining how I'd wandered off the trail and lost my bearings. As I spoke, I couldn't help but notice how intently they were all watching me. It was a bit unnerving, but I chalked it up to surprise at encountering another person in such a remote area. "You're actually quite a ways from the main trail," John said, a note of concern in his voice. "It would be dangerous for you to try to make it back on your own, especially with night coming on." I glanced at my watch, startled to realize how late it had gotten. The sun was indeed starting to dip towards the horizon, the golden light taking on an amber hue. "We have a camp set up not far from here," Sarah chimed in. She was a petite woman with long, dark hair and an easy smile. "Why don't you stay with us for the night? We can guide you back to the trail in the morning." The offer was tempting. The thought of trying to navigate the dense forest in the dark was not appealing, and these people seemed friendly enough. Still, a small voice in the back of my mind urged caution. I didn't know these people, after all. "That's very kind of you," I said, "but I wouldn't want to impose. If you could just point me in the right direction, I'm sure I can make it back before it gets too dark." The group exchanged another series of looks. This time, I couldn't miss the tension that passed between them. "I'm afraid we can't let you do that," Mike said. He was shorter than John, stocky with a neatly trimmed beard. His tone was friendly, but there was an undercurrent of something. Firmness? Threat? "It's not safe out there alone." A chill ran down my spine at his words. The clearing suddenly felt less like a paradise and more like a trap. "What do you mean, you can't let me?" I asked, taking an involuntary step back. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll be fine." Lisa, who had been quiet until now, moved to block my retreat. "You don't understand," she said, her voice soft but intense. "You're here for a reason. We've been waiting for you." Panic began to set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with 4 strangers who were now surrounding me, cutting off any escape route. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to go back to the trail. Please, just let me leave." John stepped closer, that warm smile still on his face but no longer reaching his eyes. "We can't do that, you see, you're special. Not like the others who've wandered through here. You're meant to stay." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Others. How many people had they trapped here? And what did they mean by special? I scanned the clearing, looking for any way out, but they had positioned themselves perfectly, forming a human barrier between me and the forest beyond. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. "You're making a mistake," I said, trying to reason with them. "People will come looking for me. I told friends where I was hiking. They'll notice if I don't come back." Sarah laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, we're counting on it. The more the merrier." That was when I realized the true horror of my situation. This wasn't just about me. They were using me as bait, luring more unsuspecting hikers into their trap. In that moment of clarity, survival instinct took over. I feinted to the left, then dove to the right, catching Mike off guard. I slipped past him, sprinting towards the tree line with every ounce of strength I had. I could hear them behind me, shouts of anger mixing with eerie laughter. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't afford to. I ran without direction, without thought, driven purely by the need to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I pushed on. As the light began to fade, casting long shadows through the trees, panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was lost before, but now I was well and truly in uncharted territory. The forest seemed to close in around me, every tree looking the same, every sound a potential threat. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a glimmer of hope, a thin trail, barely visible in the undergrowth. Without hesitation, I turned to follow it, praying it would lead me back to civilization. The trail wound through the forest, sometimes disappearing altogether only to reappear a few yards later. I followed it doggedly, ignoring the scratches from thorns and the ache in my muscles. As full dark settled in, I began to hear noises behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, sounds that could have been animals but that my fear-addled brain interpreted as pursuit. Were they still after me? How far had I actually managed to get from that clearing? Just when despair was starting to set in, I saw lights ahead. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, a product of exhaustion and terror. But as I drew closer, I realized it was real, a small ranger station, a beacon of safety in the darkness. I burst through the door, startling the lone ranger inside. I must have been a sight, wild-eyed, covered in scratches and dirt, gasping for breath. "Please," I managed to choke out. "You have to help me. There are people in the forest. They tried to trap me. They said there were others." The ranger, to his credit, didn't dismiss me outright. He sat me down, gave me water, and listened as I poured out my story. As I spoke, I could see the concern growing on his face. "You're not the first," he said quietly when I'd finished. "We've had reports. Disappearances, strange sightings, but never anyone who's actually encountered them and gotten away." He called for backup and took my statement. In the days that followed, as search parties combed the forest, I learned more about the dark history of those woods. Stories of a cult that had taken root there decades ago, of hikers who ventured out and never returned. They never found the clearing or any sign of John and his group. It was as if they had vanished into the forest itself. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress and exhaustion had caused some kind of breakdown, but then I remember the look in their eyes, the way they spoke about waiting for me, about others who had come before. And I know, deep in my bones, that it was real. That somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, they're still waiting, still watching, still trapping those unfortunate enough to stumble into their web. I don't go hiking anymore. The thought of the woods, once a source of joy and peace, now fills me with a primal dread. But I tell my story, hoping that it might save someone else from falling into the same trap I nearly did. Because sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. Sometimes, they're standing right in front of you, smiling and offering help, waiting for their chance to strike. The gentle rap on the door echoed through the empty cabin like a gunshot, jolting me from my uneasy sleep. In the pitch black of midnight, that soft knock might as well have been a cannon blast. As I lay there, heart pounding, a voice called out, "Hello? It's the building manager. I need to check something." That's when I knew this isolated getaway was about to become a nightmare. I'd rented this cabin as a writing retreat, a chance to escape the constant distractions of city life and finally finish my novel. It was perfect, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest, with no Wi-Fi or cell service to tempt me away from my work. The owner, a gruff local named Bill, had shown me around earlier that day before leaving me to my solitude. "No one will bother you out here," he'd said with a wink. "Just you and the trees." Those words echoed in my mind as I stared at the door, willing the knocking to stop. But it came again, more insistent this time. "I know you're in there," the voice called. "I saw the lights on earlier. It's urgent. Please open up." I sat up slowly, every nerve in my body screaming danger. Bill hadn't mentioned anything about a building manager, and why would anyone need to check something in the middle of the night? "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was a pause, then, "I'm Mark, the new building manager. There's been a problem with the water pipes in this area. I need to check your cabin to make sure everything's okay." My mind raced. The pipes had seemed fine when I'd used the shower earlier, and even if there was a problem, why check in the middle of the night? "Can't this wait until morning?" I asked, buying time as I looked around for something I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a heavy flashlight on the bedside table. "I'm afraid not," Mark replied, his tone becoming more urgent. "There's a risk of flooding. It'll only take a minute. I promise." I grabbed the flashlight and crept towards the door, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the peephole, I could make out a figure standing on the porch. He was wearing what looked like a uniform, but in the darkness, I couldn't be sure. "I'm going to need to see some ID," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. The man sighed, sounding exasperated. "Look, I left my ID in the truck. If you just open the door, I can show you my work order. We really need to check these pipes now." Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open that door. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. "I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable opening the door right now," I said firmly. "And if there's really a problem, you can come back in the morning with proper identification." There was a long silence. Then, slowly, the man's demeanor changed. The friendly tone disappeared, replaced by something cold and hard. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Open the door now, or things are going to get much worse for you." My blood ran cold. This was no building manager. Whoever was out there, they meant me harm. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The cabin had no landline, and my cell phone was useless out here. I was completely cut off. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the door. He was trying to break in. I ran to the bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. The window was my only chance. As I struggled to open the old paint-sealed window, I could hear the front door splintering. With a final heave, the window flew open, and I tumbled out into the cold night air. The forest loomed before me, dark and imposing, but I had no choice. I ran, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear angry shouts and the crash of someone else exiting through the window. I ran blindly through the woods, with only the dim moonlight to guide me. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of terror through me. Was it my pursuer, or just the natural noises of the forest? After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I stumbled upon a dirt road. Hope surged through me. Maybe this led back to civilization, to safety. But as I started down the road, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights appeared around a bend, growing brighter as they approached. For a moment, I thought of flagging them down, desperate for help. Then a horrible realization dawned on me. What if it was him? I dove off the road, hiding in a ditch as the vehicle passed. It was a truck, moving slowly, the driver clearly searching for something. For me. Once the truck had passed, I emerged from my hiding spot, shaking with fear and cold. I couldn't stay on the road, it was too exposed. But the darkness of the forest was filled with unknown dangers. As I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, a sound caught my attention, the faint rush of running water, a stream or river. Suddenly, I remembered something Bill had said during the tour of the cabin. If you follow the creek south, it'll take you straight into town. About a 5-mile hike, but it's pretty straightforward. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan I had. I plunged back into the forest, following the sound of water. The trek was grueling. The creek bed was rocky and slippery, and I was barefoot, having fled the cabin without shoes. Every step was agony, but the fear of what lay behind me pushed me forward. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, I finally saw signs of civilization. Houses appeared in the distance, then streets. I staggered into town, a wild-eyed, bedraggled figure that sent early morning joggers scurrying to the other side of the street. I made my way to the police station, my feet leaving bloody footprints on the clean linoleum floor. The officers listened to my story with growing concern, immediately dispatching units to the cabin, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder. Even my own belongings were untouched, neatly packed as if I'd never fled in terror. The police were sympathetic but skeptical. They suggested that perhaps I'd had a vivid nightmare, or that the isolation had played tricks on my mind. Part of me wanted to believe them. It would be easier, safer, to think it had all been a bad dream. But I knew what I'd experienced. The terror had been too real, the danger too palpable to have been a figment of my imagination. In the days that followed, as I tried to make sense of what had happened, I did some research. I discovered that the area had a history of disappearances, hikers and campers who had ventured into those woods and never returned. The locals had legends of something living in the forest, something that lured in unsuspecting visitors. I never found out who Mark really was, or what he wanted. Was he a deranged local preying on isolated cabins? Part of some larger, more sinister operation? Or something else entirely? Something tied to the dark history of those woods? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know that I'll never forget the terror of that night. The feeling of being hunted through the dark forest. It's a fear that still wakes me in the middle of the night, heart pounding, half expecting to hear that soft knock at my door. I never finished my novel. The words don't come anymore, choked off by the memory of that voice in the night, demanding to be let in. Instead, I find myself writing this, a warning to others who might be tempted by the allure of isolation. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what's out there in the darkness. Sometimes the real threat is the person who comes knocking at your door in the middle of the night, wearing a friendly smile and spinning a plausible lie. And in those moments, trusting your instincts might just save your life. The first rays of dawn revealed a sight that made my blood run cold. Surrounding my tent, arranged in a perfect circle, were small cairns of stacked rocks. Each pile was identical, 3 stones balanced precariously atop one another. I hadn't put them there. I was alone in these woods, or at least I thought I was. I'd set out on this solo camping trip to clear my head after a messy breakup. The idea of spending a few days alone in nature, away from the constant reminders of my failed relationship, had seemed like the perfect remedy. Now, as I stared at those ominous rock formations, I realized I might have made a terrible mistake. The previous day had been uneventful. I'd hiked deep into the wilderness, far off the main trails, to a spot I'd found on an old topographic map. It was a small clearing next to a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines, perfect for camping, and far enough from the beaten path that I was unlikely to encounter other hikers. I'd set up camp, collected firewood, and spent the evening reading by the light of my campfire. As night fell, the usual sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had lulled me into a peaceful sleep. But now, in the harsh light of morning, that peace was shattered. Someone, or something, had been in my campsite while I slept. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I unzipped my tent slowly, my eyes darting around the clearing. Everything else seemed untouched. My backpack still leaned against a nearby tree. My cooking gear sat neatly by the cold remnants of last night's fire. Only those cairns stood as evidence that anything was amiss. Stepping out of the tent, I approached the nearest pile of rocks. They were ordinary river stones, smooth and round, the kind you'd find in abundance along the brook. But the way they were balanced, so precisely, spoke of deliberate human intervention. I reached out to touch one of the cairns, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage, but it was solid, real. As my fingers brushed the top stone, the entire structure collapsed with a clatter that seemed deafening in the quiet morning air. That's when I saw it. A symbol etched into the flat surface of the bottom stone. It looked like a crude eye, carved roughly into the rock. My heart began to race. This was no random act, no prank by passing hikers. This was something else entirely. I spun around, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed different now, no longer welcoming and peaceful. The shadows between the trees looked deeper, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared in the vast wilderness. "Is anyone there?" Only the chirping of birds and the gentle rush of the brook answered me. But the feeling of being observed didn't subside. If anything, it intensified. I needed to leave. Now, whatever was going on here, I wanted no part of it. I rushed back to my tent, throwing my sleeping bag and other gear haphazardly into my backpack. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the zipper. As I was rolling up my tent, movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There, partially hidden behind a large pine, was a figure. It was too far away and too shadowed for me to make out any details, but I could clearly see that it was human-shaped and it was watching me. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, observing silently as I frantically packed up my camp. I considered leaving the tent, just grabbing my backpack and running. But some rational part of my brain reminded me that I was miles from anywhere. I needed my gear if I was going to make it back to civilization safely. So I continued packing, my movements frantic and clumsy, always keeping one eye on that motionless figure at the edge of the clearing. Every few seconds, I expected it to charge at me, but it never did. It just watched. Finally, I had everything packed. I hoisted my backpack, far too heavy for the speed I needed to move, and began to back away from the clearing. The figure remained still, but as I retreated, I could have sworn I saw others joining it. More silhouettes appearing between the trees, all watching me in eerie silence. I turned and ran. I didn't care about following the trail or preserving the wilderness. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The feeling of being pursued, of something dark and unknowable at my heels, drove me onward. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Only then did I dare to stop and look back. The forest behind me was empty. No sign of pursuit, no mysterious figures, just trees and shadows. But still, that feeling of being watched persisted. I didn't know where I was. In my panic, I'd run blindly, paying no attention to direction or landmarks. The sun, now higher in the sky, told me it was roughly east, but that was little help. I hadn't paid enough attention to the topographic map to know which way led back to the trailhead. My options were limited. I could try to retrace my steps, but the thought of going back towards that clearing, towards those watching figures, made my skin crawl. Or I could pick a direction and hope it led me back to a trail, or a road, or any sign of civilization. I chose the latter, setting off at a brisk pace. I tried to move quietly now, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. But the forest was alive with noise, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the wind rustling through the leaves. Any one of those sounds could be covering the approach of something more sinister. As the day wore on, my fear began to mix with exhaustion and thirst. I'd left my water bottle back at the campsite, too panicked to remember it in my haste to leave. The sun beat down through gaps in the canopy, and sweat soaked my clothes. But I didn't dare stop at any of the small streams I crossed. Irrational as it was, I felt that the moment I stopped moving, they would catch up to me. It was late afternoon when I finally heard something that wasn't natural forest noise. A car engine, distant but unmistakable. Civilization, safety. I moved towards the sound with renewed energy. As I got closer, trees began to thin out. Finally, I burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road. I could have cried with relief. A little ways down the road, I could see a pickup truck approaching. I waved my arms frantically, probably looking like a madman. The truck slowed to a stop, and an older man leaned out the window, eyeing me warily. "You all right, son?" he asked, taking in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. I babbled out my story, the rock piles, the watching figures, my frantic flight through the woods. Even as I spoke, I realized how crazy it all sounded. The man listened patiently, his expression shifting from concern to something like understanding. "You're not the first to come out of those woods with a story like that," he said quietly. "There's things in this forest that ain't natural, things that don't take kindly to visitors." He gave me a ride back to my car, parked at a trailhead that turned out to be nearly 10 miles from where I'd emerged from the forest. As we drove, he told me about the local legends, stories of hikers gone missing, of strange sightings deep in the woods, of ancient rituals and entities older than human civilization. I never reported what happened to the authorities. Who would believe me? A story about mysterious rock piles and shadowy figures, with no evidence but my own frantic testimony. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if I imagined it all, if the solitude and the aftermath of my breakup had caused some kind of mental break. But then I remember the feeling of those eyes on me, the silent, watching presence that followed me through the forest. And I know, deep in my bones, that it was real, that something out there in those woods had marked me, had tried to claim me for its own unknowable purpose. I don't go camping anymore. The thought of sleeping in a tent, vulnerable and alone in the wilderness, fills me with a primal dread. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whistles through the trees outside my window, I find myself wondering about those rock piles. Are they still there in that clearing? Are they waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to stumble upon them? And sometimes, in those moments between sleeping and waking, I could swear I see a figure standing in the corner of my room, silent, watching, waiting. A reminder that some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and that the true horrors of this world don't always lurk in the darkness of the forest. Sometimes, they follow you home. "I know where you're going," the stranger whispered, his breath hot against my ear as the plane began its descent. In that moment, suspended thousands of feet above the earth, I realized this red-eye flight had become a prison, and my seatmate was far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The journey had started ordinarily enough. I'd booked a last-minute red-eye flight from New York to Los Angeles, dreading the 6-hour journey but needing to be there for an important meeting the next morning. The airport was quiet when I arrived. just a handful of sleepy travelers shuffling through security. I boarded the plane, finding my aisle seat in the middle of the aircraft. As I stowed my carry-on and settled in, I silently hoped the seat next to me would remain empty. No such luck. Just before the doors closed, a man slid into the window seat beside me. He was unremarkable at first glance. Average height, brown hair, probably in his late 30s. He gave me a polite nod as he sat down, and I returned it before putting on my headphones, fully intending to sleep through the flight. As we took off, I noticed him fidgeting, his fingers drumming an erratic pattern on the armrest between us. I chalked it up to nerves. Plenty of people get anxious during takeoff, but as the seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin settled into the quiet hum of a night flight, his restlessness only seemed to increase. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and willing sleep to come, but every few minutes, I'd feel his elbow nudge mine on the shared armrest, or hear him shifting in his seat. After about an hour of this, I gave up on sleep and opened my eyes with a sigh. That's when I caught him staring at me. It wasn't a casual glance. His eyes were fixed, intense, like he was trying to memorize every detail of my face. When he saw me looking back, he didn't avert his gaze or appear embarrassed. Instead, a slow smile spread across his face. "Can't sleep either, huh?" he said, his voice low and oddly intimate in the hushed cabin. I nodded, uncomfortable but not wanting to be rude. "Yeah, it's always tough on these night flights." "Where are you headed?" he asked, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Los Angeles," I replied, keeping my answer vague. Something about his demeanor made me hesitant to share any personal information. "Business or pleasure?" he pressed. "Business," I said shortly, hoping my tone would discourage further conversation. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "You know, I've always found it fascinating how we put so much trust in strangers when we fly. We sit next to them for hours, sleep next to them, breathe the same recycled air, and we never really know who they are or what they're capable of." A chill ran down my spine. This was not normal small talk. I looked around, hoping to catch the eye of a flight attendant, but the cabin was dark and quiet. Most passengers were asleep, and the crew was nowhere to be seen. "I suppose," I said non-committally, desperately wishing I had chosen a different seat, a different flight, anything to be away from this man. "For instance," he continued, seemingly oblivious to my discomfort, "you don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. A businessman like yourself, a tourist, or maybe—" He paused, his eyes glinting in the dim cabin light. "Maybe I'm someone who's been watching you for a very long time, waiting for the perfect opportunity." My heart began to race. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? But the look in his eyes told me he was deadly serious. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say, my mouth dry with fear. "I think you have me confused with someone else." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, I don't think so. John Emerson, 42 years old, executive at Pinnacle Industries, lived at 1542 Maple Street for the past 8 years. Recently divorced, one daughter, Emily, age 7. You're heading to Los Angeles for a merger meeting with Apex Corp. Did I miss anything?" I felt the blood drain from my face. How could he possibly know all of that? My mind raced, trying to remember if I'd mentioned any of this information loudly at the airport or while boarding. But I knew I hadn't. This was information only someone who had been stalking me would know. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear making my voice shake. "What do you want?" He leaned in even closer, his lips almost brushing my ear. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that I know everything about you, John. Everything you've done, everything you're going to do. And I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions." I tried to stand up, to call for help, to do anything, but he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice still quiet but now laced with unmistakable menace. "We wouldn't want to cause a scene, would we?" Besides, who would believe you? I'm just a fellow passenger making friendly conversation. He was right, and he knew it. In the dark cabin, with most passengers asleep, any commotion I caused would likely be seen as an overreaction. I'd be the one who looked unstable, not him. For the next few hours, I sat in silent terror as he continued to talk. He recounted details of my life that no stranger should know. Childhood memories, private conversations, even thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. It was as if he had been living inside my head for years. As the flight wore on, his monologue took a darker turn. He began to speak of mistakes I'd made, of people I'd hurt, both intentionally and unintentionally. He knew about the colleague I'd stepped over for a promotion, the old friend I'd abandoned when they needed me most, even the white lies I'd told my daughter. "We all have our sins, John," he said, his voice taking on an almost philosophical tone. "But some sins require penance. And yours? Well, let's just say the bill has come due." As he spoke, I racked my brain trying to figure out who he could be. A disgruntled employee I'd fired, a relative of someone I'd wronged in business. But none of it made sense. The level of knowledge he had about my life went beyond what even a determined stalker could uncover. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that this nightmare flight was almost over, but dread at what might happen once we landed. Would he follow me off the plane? Was someone waiting for me at the airport? That's when he leaned in one last time and whispered those chilling words, "I know where you're going." The plane touched down with a jolt, and as the seatbelt sign dinged off, he stood up smoothly. "It's been a pleasure, John," he said, his voice suddenly normal, as if we'd just shared a pleasant conversation. "Do enjoy your stay in Los Angeles, and remember, we'll be watching." He melted into the crowd of passengers disembarking, leaving me frozen in my seat, my mind reeling. By the time I gathered myself enough to move, he was long gone. I stumbled off the plane in a daze, half expecting to be accosted at every turn, but nothing happened. I made it through the airport and to my hotel without incident. The meeting the next day went ahead as planned, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every stranger's glance, every overheard snippet of conversation seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Was this part of my mysterious seatmate's plan? To make me paranoid? To have me constantly looking over my shoulder? I never saw him again, never found out who he was or how he knew so much about me. But his words haunted me, forcing me to reevaluate my life, my choices, my relationships. In a way, maybe that was his true purpose, not to harm me physically, but to shake me to my core, to make me confront the person I'd become. Years have passed since that flight, and I've made many changes in my life. I've tried to right old wrongs to be a better person, but still, every time I board a plane, I can't help but tense up as I see who's sitting next to me. Because now I know that sometimes, the most terrifying journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the secrets we keep and the sins we try to hide. And somewhere out there, I know he's still watching, waiting to see if I've truly learned my lesson. The moment I saw the hitchhiker's thumb jutting out from the darkness, I knew I should have kept driving. But something, curiosity, compassion, or perhaps a twisted sense of fate, made me slow down. As I pulled over, the glare of my headlights illuminated a face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It had been a long day, and an even longer drive. I was heading back from a business trip, taking the scenic route through winding country roads rather than the monotonous highway. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with the humming of my car engine and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. I was about an hour from home when I saw him, a solitary figure on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb raised in the universal signal for a ride. In the split second it took me to register his presence, I had already begun to slow down. As I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires, I got my first good look at the hitchhiker. He was a man, probably in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Dark, intense, and fixed on me with an unsettling focus. I rolled down the passenger window, the cool night air rushing in. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, despite the nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right. "Just up the road a ways," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Mighty kind of you to stop." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. "Hop in," I said, forcing a smile. He slid into the passenger seat with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. As I pulled back onto the road, I could feel his eyes on me, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "So," I said, desperate to break the uncomfortable silence, "what brings you out here so late?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes a man just needs to wander." I nodded, not knowing how to respond to that. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the darkness of the countryside pressing in around us. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. "You ever pick up hitchhikers often?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "No, not really. To be honest, I'm not sure why I stopped tonight." He turned to look at me then, and in the glow of the dashboard lights, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something hungry and predatory. "Maybe it was fate," he said softly. "Maybe you were meant to pick me up." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean by that?" Instead of answering, he reached into his jacket pocket. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he going to pull out a weapon, rob me, or worse? But what he produced was a small, leather-bound book. He opened it and began to read aloud, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "And lo, on the 13th night, a traveler shall offer kindness to a stranger on the road. But beware, for this act of mercy shall unleash a darkness beyond imagining." I glanced at him, confusion and fear warring within me. "What is that? Some kind of Bible?" He laughed again, that same humorless sound. "Oh no, my friend. This is something much older, much more powerful than any Bible." As he spoke, I noticed something strange happening. The darkness outside seemed to be getting thicker, more oppressive. The headlights, which had been cutting a clear path through the night, now seemed to be swallowed up just a few feet in front of the car. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "What are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything," he replied calmly. "This is all you. You're the one who stopped. You're the one who let me in. And now you're the one who's going to help me complete the ritual." I tried to focus on driving, but the road ahead had disappeared entirely. It was as if we were floating in a void, with only the interior of the car remaining solid and real. "Now stop the car," he commanded. Without thinking, I obeyed, bringing the vehicle to a halt in the middle of the nothingness. As soon as we stopped moving, the hitchhiker began to change. His features seemed to melt and shift, becoming something inhuman, something ancient and terrible. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to open the door and run, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed with fear, as the thing that had once been a man turned its attention fully on me. "For centuries, I have waited for this moment," it said, its voice now a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "For the one who would willingly invite me in, who would give me passage into your world." Tears streamed down my face as I realized the magnitude of what I had done. In my simple act of kindness, I had unleashed something unspeakable upon the world. The creature reached out with a hand that was no longer human, its fingers elongating into wicked claws. As those claws touched my forehead, searing pain shot through my entire body. Images flashed before my eyes, countless ages of darkness, of hunger, of patient waiting. And then, As suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I found myself alone in my car, parked on the side of the road. The hitchhiker was gone, leaving no trace that he had ever been there. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that what had happened was real. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I had experienced. When I finally arrived, I stumbled into my house and collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and shell-shocked. It wasn't until the next morning, when I saw the news, that I understood the full implications of what had occurred. Reports were coming in from all over the country. Strange sightings, unexplained phenomena, people going missing in droves. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was all my fault. I had been the unwitting key, the one who had opened the door and let this ancient evil back into the world. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to warn people, to explain what had happened. But who would believe such a fantastical story? I was dismissed as a crackpot, a lunatic raving about hitchhikers and dark rituals. As the world descended into chaos around me, I retreated into isolation. I couldn't bear to watch the consequences of my actions unfold, to see the suffering I had inadvertently caused. Years have passed since that fateful night, and the world has changed beyond recognition. The darkness that I let in has spread, transforming everything it touches, and through it all, I've carried the weight of my guilt. The knowledge that with one simple act of kindness, I brought about the end of the world as we knew it. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the horrors outside seem distant, I find myself thinking back to that moment on the dark road. I wonder what would have happened if I had just kept driving, if I had ignored that outstretched thumb and continued on my way home. But then I remember the hitchhiker's words. Maybe it was fate. And I wonder if, perhaps it was always meant to happen this way. If I was always destined to be the one who would unwittingly usher in this new age of darkness. And in those moments, as I listen to the sounds of a world forever changed, I can't help but offer a word of warning to anyone who might hear it. Be careful who you let into your car on a dark and lonely road, because sometimes the real monster isn't waiting in the shadows. Sometimes it's the one sitting right beside you, waiting for an invitation. The scent hit me first, an odd mix of spices and something metallic that made my stomach churn. As I stepped into the neighbor's backyard for the potluck, I had no idea I was walking into a nightmare that would forever change my understanding of suburban life and the darkness that can lurk behind perfect picket fences. I'd moved into the neighborhood just 6 months ago, desperate for a fresh start after my divorce. The house was a bit of a fixer-upper, but the street seemed nice enough, quiet, with well-maintained lawns and friendly waves from passing neighbors. When Sarah, the perky blonde from across the street, invited me to the annual neighborhood potluck, I saw it as a chance to finally integrate into the community. "Oh, you simply must come," she'd gushed, her smile almost too wide. "Everyone will be there, and it's the perfect way to get to know your neighbors." I agreed, more out of politeness than any real desire to socialize. I wasn't much of a cook, so I picked up a pasta salad from the local deli on my way home from work that day. As I walked up the driveway to Bob and Linda's house, the hosts for this year's gathering, I could hear the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter from the backyard. I rounded the corner of the house, pasta salad in hand, and that's when that strange smell hit me. The backyard was beautifully decorated, strings of lights crisscrossing overhead and tables laden with food. But something felt off. The laughter I'd heard earlier seemed forced now, the smiles on my neighbors' faces a bit too fixed. Sarah spotted me and hurried over, that too wide smile still in place. "You made it," she exclaimed, taking the pasta salad from my hands. "Come, let me introduce you to everyone." As she led me around, making introductions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being sized up. The neighbors were polite, but their eyes seemed to bore into me, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Help yourself to some food, Sarah said, gesturing to the buffet table. Linda's made her famous meat pie. It's to die for. I approached the table, my earlier hunger now replaced by a vague sense of unease. The spread was impressive, but as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. Every dish seemed to contain meat, often in unusual combinations. There was a Jell-O salad with what looked like chunks of ham suspended in it, deviled eggs topped with bacon bits. Even the fruit salad had bits of what I hoped were just oddly colored berries but feared might be something else entirely. I took a small portion of what seemed to be the safest option, a simple-looking casserole, and found a seat at one of the tables. As I sat down, Bob, the host, plopped down next to me. "So, how are you settling in?" he asked, his tone friendly but his eyes watchful. "Oh, fine," I replied, pushing the food around on my plate. "The house needs some work, but the neighborhood seems nice." Bob nodded, taking a large bite of the meat pie. "We're a close-knit community here," he said after swallowing. "We look out for our own. You'll see." There was something in the way he said it that made me pause. It sounded less like a reassurance and more like a warning. As the evening wore on, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. The conversation around me seemed normal enough. Talk of local sports teams, complaints about property taxes, gossip about absent neighbors. But there was an undercurrent to it all, a tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. I noticed that while everyone else was eating with gusto, I had barely touched my food. The casserole on my plate had cooled, congealing into an unappetizing mass. As I looked around, I realized something else. I seemed to be the only one not eating the meat dishes. Linda, Bob's wife, appeared at my elbow. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet. "You've hardly eaten anything." "Oh, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just not very hungry, I guess." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "You really should try the meat pie," she insisted. "It's an old family recipe." Before I could protest, she had whisked away my plate and returned with a generous slice of the pie. The smell of it, that same spicy metallic odor I'd noticed earlier, made my stomach lurch. "Go on," Linda urged, watching me intently. "Take a bite." I felt the eyes of the entire gathering on me. The chatter had died down, and an expectant hush had fallen over the backyard. With a shaking hand, I lifted a forkful of the pie to my mouth. Just as I was about to take a bite, a loud crash from inside the house made everyone jump. Linda's head snapped towards the sound, her face contorting with anger. "Excuse me," she said tightly, hurrying towards the house. In the momentary distraction, I dropped my fork, the bite of pie falling back to the plate. As conversation slowly resumed around me, I took the opportunity to slip away from the table. I made my way to the edge of the yard, trying to calm my racing heart. What was wrong with me? Why was I letting my imagination run wild? These were just normal people having a normal barbecue, weren't they? As I stood there, trying to talk myself down, I overheard a hushed conversation from the other side of the fence. "Can't keep him locked up forever," one voice was saying. "We don't have a choice," another replied. "If he talks when we're all finished, maybe we should just take care of it. Add him to the next batch." My blood ran cold. Surely, I had misheard. They couldn't be talking about what I thought they were talking about. I was about to lean in closer when a hand grabbed my arm. I whirled around to find Sarah standing there, her ever-present smile now looking more like a grimace. "There you are," she said, her fingers digging into my arm. "We were worried you'd left. The party's just getting started." She began to steer me back towards the gathering, her grip uncomfortably tight. As we walked, I noticed Bob and a few other men emerging from the house. They were wiping their hands on rags, and I could have sworn I saw dark stains that looked unsettlingly like blood. "Listen," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I'm not feeling well. I think I should head home." Sarah's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Oh, but you can't leave now," she said, Not when you haven't even tried Linda's meat pie. It would be rude. The way she said that last word sent a chill down my spine. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but I was surrounded. The neighbors had formed a loose circle around me, their faces no longer bothering with the pretense of friendliness. Bob stepped forward, holding a plate with a slice of the infamous meat pie. "Oh, come on, neighbor," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Just one bite. Then you'll be one of us." In that moment, I knew with terrifying certainty that if I ate that pie, I would never leave this backyard. With a surge of adrenaline, I shoved past Sarah and ran for the gate. I could hear shouts behind me as I sprinted down the street towards my house. I didn't stop running until I was inside, doors locked and curtains drawn. The police, when I called them, were skeptical. They found no evidence of anything unusual at Bob and Linda's house, no signs of the disturbing conversation I'd overheard. The neighbors all vouched for each other, claiming it was just a normal potluck that I had misunderstood. In the days that followed, I became a pariah in the neighborhood. Whispers followed me whenever I left the house. Cars slowed down as they passed by, the drivers watching me with undisguised hostility. I put my house on the market a week later, unable to bear the constant fear and paranoia. As I was packing up to leave, Sarah came by one last time. "We're sorry to see you go," she said, that fake smile still plastered on her face. "We had such high hopes for you, but I suppose not everyone is cut out for our little community." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Oh, and if you're ever in the neighborhood again, do stop by. Linda's always happy to whip up another meat pie." I shuddered as I closed the door behind her, relief washing over me at the thought of leaving this place behind. But even now, years later and miles away, I can't shake the memory of that night. The smell of that meat pie still haunts my dreams, and every time I'm invited to a neighborhood gathering, I find myself making excuses not to attend. Because now I know that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're the ones living right next door, hiding behind friendly smiles and perfect lawns, waiting for the chance to make you one of them. The old man's eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity as he invited me into his cabin. Come in," he said, his voice as creaky as the floorboards beneath our feet. "It's not often I get visitors out here." Little did I know that stepping over that threshold would plunge me into a nightmare I'd spend years trying to escape. I'd been hiking alone in the mountains, a much-needed break from the chaos of city life and the pressures of my demanding job. The trail I'd chosen was remote, winding through dense forests and along steep ridges. I'd seen more wildlife than people in the 3 days I'd been out here, which was exactly what I'd wanted. As the sun began to dip below the tree line on that 4th day, I realized I'd miscalculated. The next designated campsite was still miles away, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. That's when I saw it, a thin wisp of smoke rising above the trees, a telltale sign of civilization in this wilderness. I veered off the trail, following the smoke. After about half a mile, I emerged into a small clearing. There, nestled against the side of the mountain, stood a cabin that looked like it had been there for 100 years. Its logs were weathered gray, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of time. On the porch sat an old man in a rocking chair, his beard long and wild, his eyes sharp, despite the wrinkles surrounding them. He didn't seem surprised to see me, as if hikers stumbled upon his isolated home every day. "Looks like you could use a place to rest," he called out as I approached. "Name's Jack. This here's my home." I introduced myself, explaining my situation. Jack nodded knowingly. "Mountains can be tricky," he said. "Weather changes fast up here. You're welcome to stay the night if you'd like. Got plenty of room." Gratitude washed over me. The thought of a roof over my head and maybe even a warm meal was too tempting to pass up. That's when Jack uttered those fateful words, inviting me inside. The interior of the cabin was a cluttered maze of furniture, books, and odd trinkets. Animal skulls adorned the walls, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, and something else I couldn't quite place, something earthy and slightly sweet. Jack busied himself in the small kitchen area, putting a kettle on the wood stove. "Make yourself comfortable," he said. "I'll fix us some tea." I settled into an overstuffed armchair, my backpack at my feet. As Jack puttered around, I took in more details of the cabin. There were no photos, no personal touches that you'd expect in someone's home. Instead, the walls were covered in strange symbols and diagrams, drawn or carved directly onto the wood. "You've got quite a collection here," I said, trying to make conversation. "Have you lived up here long?" Jack chuckled, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "Longer than you'd believe, son. This mountain and I, we go way back." He brought over 2 steaming mugs, handing one to me. The tea had an odd color, a deep purple that seemed to shimmer in the low light. I took a cautious sip. It was unlike anything I'd ever tasted, bitter and sweet at the same time, with an aftertaste that lingered on my tongue. As we drank, Jack began to talk. He spoke of the mountain, of the forest, of the creatures that called this wilderness home. His words painted vivid pictures, and I found myself drawn into his tales. There was something hypnotic about his voice, about the way his stories seemed to weave together into one endless narrative. I'm not sure how long we sat there, Jack talking and me listening. The light outside had faded completely, and the cabin was illuminated only by the flickering glow of the wood stove. As Jack spoke, I began to feel strange. The room seemed to pulse and shift around me, the shadows on the walls taking on lives of their own. "Are you feeling it yet?" Jack asked, his voice suddenly clear and sharp, cutting through the haze that had settled over my mind. I tried to respond, but my tongue felt thick and unwieldy in my mouth. The tea. There had been something in the tea. Jack leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "Do you know why I'm here, son? Why I've been on this mountain for so long?" I shook my head, my movements slow and uncoordinated. "I'm a guardian," he said, his voice taking on a rhythmic, almost chant-like quality. "I keep the old ways alive. I maintain the balance between your world and the other." As he spoke, the cabin seemed to fade away. We were no longer sitting in chairs, but on a forest floor. The trees around us were ancient, their trunks wider than any I'd ever seen. And they were alive, not just in the way that all trees are alive, but consciously, aware. I could feel their attention on us, could sense their curiosity and their hunger. "The forest remembers," Jack intoned. "It remembers a time before your cities, before your machines. It remembers when humans knew their place in the natural order." I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, not just physically but mentally, caught in the web of Jack's words and the power of whatever he'd given me. "Every so often," Jack continued, "the forest demands a sacrifice, a reminder to humanity of the old covenant. And you, my friend, you're going to help me fulfill that covenant." Terror coursed through me as I realized the full implications of what he was saying. I wasn't a guest, I was an offering. Jack stood, his form seeming to grow and shift. He was no longer just an old man, but something ancient and terrible. He reached out a hand, no longer a hand at all, but a gnarled branch, and touched my forehead. Images flooded my mind. I saw the forest as it had been thousands of years ago, teeming with life both natural and supernatural. I saw humans living in harmony with the land, respecting its power and its mysteries, and I saw the slow encroachment of civilization, the cutting and burning of the ancient trees, the forgetting of the old ways. "Do you understand now?" Jack's voice echoed in my head. "Do you see why this is necessary?" I did understand, and that was the most terrifying part of all. In that moment, altered by whatever Jack had given me and connected to the ancient consciousness of the forest, I could see the logic behind the horror. I could feel the forest's pain, its anger at being forgotten and abused, but understanding didn't make me any less afraid. As Jack began to chant in a language I'd never heard before, I felt myself being pulled apart. It wasn't physical, my body remained intact, but my consciousness, my very essence, was being stretched and dispersed. I was becoming one with the forest. I could feel my awareness spreading out, touching every tree, every leaf, every grain of soil. The boundary between self and other dissolved, and I was everywhere and nowhere at once. Through it all, Jack's voice continued, guiding and shaping the transformation. I don't know how long it lasted. Time had lost all meaning. But eventually, slowly, I began to coalesce back into myself. I came to on the floor of the cabin, my body drenched in sweat, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. Jack was gone. The cabin was empty, looking abandoned and decrepit, as if no one had lived there for years. On shaky legs, I stumbled outside. The forest looked different now. I could sense things I'd never noticed before. The communication between trees, the flow of nutrients in the soil, the intricate web of life that connected everything. I made my way back to the trail in a daze, my pack feeling impossibly heavy on my shoulders. When I finally reached civilization, days later than planned, I tried to tell people what had happened, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. Who would believe a story about an old man in the woods who could commune with an ancient forest spirit? In the years since, I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But I can't shake the connection I now feel to the natural world. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods, I swear I can hear whispers in a language I almost understand, and sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of an old man with a wild beard, watching me from between the trees. I don't go hiking alone anymore. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrible, and some mysteries are better left uncovered. But a part of me knows that one day the forest will call again, and when it does, I'm not sure I'll be able to resist answering. The text message from Emily's phone chilled me to the bone. Help me, they're watching. But Emily had vanished into the woods hours ago, and there was no cell service for miles. As I stared at the impossible message, the realization dawned that our weekend getaway had become something far more sinister. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just Emily and me escaping the city for a few days of peace in nature. We'd been best friends since college, and with both of us going through rough patches in our personal lives, this cabin retreat seemed like the perfect remedy. We arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon, the late autumn sun casting long shadows through the trees. The place was exactly as advertised, a cozy two-bedroom structure nestled in a clearing, with a wraparound porch and a view of the nearby lake. It was picturesque, almost too perfect. That first evening was exactly what we needed. We sat on the porch, drinking wine and catching up, laughing about old times and commiserating over our current struggles. As night fell, the woods around us came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. "This is exactly what I needed," Emily said, leaning back in her chair with a contented sigh. "Just us, nature, and no cell phones." I nodded in agreement, raising my glass in a toast. To unplugging and recharging. We'd made a pact to keep our phones off for the weekend, to truly disconnect from the outside world. It was liberating, but little did I know how that decision would come back to haunt me. The next morning, we decided to explore the trails around the cabin. The forest was beautiful, the trees a riot of red and gold leaves. We hiked for a couple of hours, taking in the scenery and enjoying the crisp autumn air. It was on our way back that things started to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, made me jump. Emily noticed my unease. "You okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I forced a smile. Yeah, just a bit jumpy, I guess. Too used to city life. She laughed, but I noticed her eyes darting around, as if she too sensed something amiss. We were about a mile from the cabin when Emily stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened intently but heard nothing unusual. "Hear what?" I thought I heard. "Never mind," she said, shaking her head. "Let's just get back to the cabin." We picked up our pace, the earlier leisurely stroll now a brisk walk. The feeling of being observed intensified, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. We were within sight of the cabin when Emily suddenly veered off the trail. "I dropped my bracelet earlier," she said. "I'm just going to run back and look for it. You go on ahead, I'll be right behind you." Something in her voice made me hesitate. "You sure? I can come with you." "No, it's fine," she insisted, already backing away. "I'll be quick. Promise." Against my better judgment, I let her go. That was the last time I saw her. I waited at the cabin for an hour, then 2. As the sun began to set, panic set in. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back out, calling Emily's name. The woods seemed different now, hostile. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, and more than once I thought I saw figures darting between the trees. After what felt like hours of searching, I returned to the cabin, hoping against hope that Emily had somehow made it back while I was out looking. But the cabin was empty, silent except for the creaking of the old wooden structure. That's when I broke our pact. I turned on my phone, desperate to call for help. No signal, of course. But then, impossibly, a text message appeared. "Help me. They're watching." It was from Emily's number. My hands shook as I tried to reply, but the message wouldn't send. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. More messages started coming through, each one more terrifying than the last. "I can't get out. The trees aren't trees. Don't trust what you see." I was in full panic mode now. I ran outside, holding my phone up, trying to find even a bar of signal. That's when I saw them. Shadows moving at the edge of the clearing. Not animal shapes, but something wrong. Elongated limbs, 2 tall bodies, movements that were fluid yet jerky at the same time. I ran back inside, slamming the door and pushing furniture against it. My phone buzzed again. "They're coming for you next." I huddled in the corner of the cabin, my eyes darting between the windows and my phone. More messages kept coming, describing horrors I couldn't begin to comprehend. Emily wrote about a world beneath the forest, about creatures that wore human skin, about a hunger older than time itself. As the night wore on, the noises outside grew louder, scratching at the walls, whispers in a language that hurt my ears, heavy footsteps on the porch. I was trapped, with no way to call for help and no idea what was out there. With trembling hands, I typed out a reply to Emily. "Where are you? How can I help?" The response came instantly. "You can't. It's too late for me. Run. Don't look back." But I couldn't leave, not without Emily. As dawn broke, the noises outside subsided. I cautiously moved the furniture and opened the door. The clearing looked normal in the early morning light. Birds were chirping. A light mist hung over the ground. It was as if the terrors of the night had been a bad dream. Then I saw it. Emily's bracelet, the one she'd gone back to find, hanging from a low branch just at the edge of the woods. As I approached it, my phone buzzed one last time. "I'm sorry. I led them to you. Forgive me." I reached for the bracelet, but as my fingers touched it, the world seemed to shift. The trees began to move, their bark splitting to reveal eyes and mouths. The ground beneath my feet turned soft, like I was standing on flesh rather than soil. I ran like I've never run before, leaving everything behind. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, miles away. A passing car picked me up, the driver alarmed at my wild appearance and incoherent babbling. The authorities searched the woods for days. They found the cabin, undisturbed. They found our belongings, including both our phones, switched off just as we'd left them. But they never found Emily. I've tried to move on, to forget what happened that weekend. But sometimes, late at night, my phone will buzz with a text from an unknown number. And for a split second before I block it, I'll see a message that makes my blood run cold. We're still watching. We're always watching. I don't go to the woods anymore. I don't go anywhere without cell service. And I never ever turn off my phone. Because now I know that sometimes the messages we receive from the void are real. And sometimes the monsters lurking in the shadows are hungry for more than just our fear. The flickering neon sign of the gas station was a beacon in the darkness, promising safety and civilization. But as I pulled into the empty lot, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about this place felt wrong, and I was about to discover just how right that instinct was. I'd been driving for hours, making my way cross-country for a new job opportunity. The interstate had been mind-numbingly boring, so I'd decided to take a scenic detour through back roads. It had seemed like a good idea at the time, a chance to see some of the country's hidden beauty. Now, as midnight approached and my gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, I was regretting that decision. The gas station appeared like a mirage in the desert of darkness. It was an old place, the kind you don't see much anymore. A single island of pumps in front of a small convenience store, all bathed in the sickly glow of fluorescent lights. The sign proclaimed it to be Pete's Gas Grocery, though the letters were faded and peeling. I pulled up to the pump, the gravel crunching under my tires. The silence when I cut the engine was absolute. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the hum of the overhead lights. Just a perfect, unnatural quiet. As I got out of the car, a gust of wind kicked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. I shivered, suddenly wishing I hadn't stopped here. But my need for gas outweighed my unease, so I reached for the pump. That's when I noticed the handwritten sign taped to it. Pay inside first. I sighed, irritated at the inconvenience but understanding the need for caution in such a remote location. I made my way to the store, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The bell above the door jangled as I entered, the sound harsh and jarring. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered, shelves stocked with a hodgepodge of snacks, automotive supplies, and mysterious canned goods. Behind the counter stood a man, presumably Pete, his back to me as he restocked a cigarette display. "Evening," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual despite the growing sense of unease in my gut. "Just need to pay for some gas." Pete turned slowly, and I had to stifle a gasp. His face was a maze of scars, one eye milky white and sightless. His good eye fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to flee. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. I blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry." "It's not safe," he continued, his gaze never wavering. "Not tonight. You need to leave." My heart began to race. "Look, I just need some gas. I'll be on my way as soon as—" "You don't understand," Pete interrupted, leaning forward over the counter. "They're coming. They always come on nights like this." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's coming?" Pete opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the lights flickered and died. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of the neon sign outside. "Too late," Pete whispered, and the fear in his voice made my blood run cold. In the distance, I heard something. A low, thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It grew louder, drowning out the frantic beating of my heart. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The engines," Pete replied. "They're here." As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw headlights approaching, dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronization. They surrounded the gas station, hemming us in. "Who are they?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. Pete's scarred face was grim in the faint light. "Don't know. Don't want to know. They come every few months, always on the darkest nights. They take what they want and leave. Sometimes they take people." The vehicles outside had stopped moving, forming a perfect circle around the station. In the eerie glow of their headlights, I could see that these weren't normal cars. They were massive, hulking things, more like tanks than automobiles, and they were utterly silent now, their engines cut, but that strange thrumming sound still filling the air. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep the terror out of my voice. "We wait," Pete said simply, "and we hope they don't come inside." But even as he spoke, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Something was approaching the store. Pete motioned frantically for me to hide behind the counter. I complied, my legs shaking so badly I could barely walk. From my hiding spot, I had a clear view of the door. It opened slowly, the bell's cheerful jingle now sounding like a death knell. A figure entered, tall, impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like a hazmat suit. Its face was hidden behind a reflective visor, but I had the horrible feeling that what lay beneath was far from human. The being moved through the store with an unnatural grace, stopping at seemingly random intervals to pick up items: a can of beans, a road map, a lighter. It placed each item in a bag it carried, movements precise and economical. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't come behind the counter. Pete stood stock still, his good eye never leaving the creature. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the being approached the counter. It placed its bag down and produced a small, cube-like device. The cube emitted a soft blue glow and a series of clicks and whirs. Pete nodded, as if understanding some unspoken communication. He opened the register and began placing money, not just bills but coins as well, into the creature's bag. Once the register was empty, the being turned to leave, but as it reached the door, it paused. Slowly, it turned its head, that reflective visor seeming to stare directly at my hiding spot. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we looked at each other. I could see my terrified reflection in its visor, and behind that, just for a second, I thought I glimpsed something. Eyes that were not eyes, a face that was not a face. Then it was gone, the door closing behind it with a final, cheerful jingle. The parking lot erupted into motion, engines roaring to life, but not the engines of any vehicles I'd ever heard. The sound was alien, wrong, vibrating in my chest and making my teeth ache. As quickly as they had come, the strange vehicles departed, their lights disappearing into the darkness. Pete let out a long, shaky breath. "It's over, for now." I stood on trembling legs, my mind reeling. What was that?" Pete shook his head. "Don't know. Don't want to know. They've been coming for years, always the same. They take what they want, leave that weird money. Best not to question it." But we have to tell someone," I protested. "The police, the government, someone." Pete's laugh was bitter. "You think they don't know? Why do you think this station is still here, in the middle of nowhere? We're like a feeding station. Keep them satisfied here. Maybe they don't go to the towns." I felt sick. "So we just let this happen?" "We survive," Pete said simply. "Now, you best be on your way. Sun'll be up soon, and you don't want to be here when the cleanup crew arrives. They don't like witnesses." In a daze, I pumped my gas and got back on the road. As I drove, the events of the night seemed to fade like a bad dream. By the time I reached the next town, I had almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue and too much caffeine. Almost. But sometimes, on dark nights when I'm driving alone, I'll see lights in my rearview mirror. Lights moving too fast, too synchronized to be normal traffic. And I'll remember that night at Pete's gas grocery, and the terrifying truth I learned. We are not alone. And the things that share our world are not always hiding in the shadows. Sometimes, they're right there in plain sight, filling up their tanks and buying snacks, reminding us that the line between our world and theirs is far thinner than we'd like to believe. The snap of a twig behind me shattered the tranquil silence of the forest. I froze mid-step, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. As I slowly turned to look over my shoulder, I saw nothing but dense foliage and lengthening shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger with each passing second. Little did I know, this solitary hike was about to become a nightmarish game of cat and mouse. I'd set out early that morning, eager to tackle one of the more challenging trails in the state park. It was a route I'd been wanting to try for months, a 15-mile loop that promised stunning views and a real test of endurance. As an experienced hiker, I felt confident in my abilities and had packed accordingly. Plenty of water, high-energy snacks, first aid kit, and a fully charged phone, though I knew service would be spotty at best. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through old-growth forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. I took my time, stopping often to snap photos or simply soak in the majesty of nature. By early afternoon, I'd reached the halfway point and stopped for lunch on a rocky outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. It was as I was packing up to continue that I first felt it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, attributing the feeling to the isolation of the trail. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, which was unusual even for this remote route, but not unheard of. As I continued along the trail, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The birds had gone quiet, and even the rustling of small animals in the underbrush had ceased. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and increasingly rapid breathing. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig, too loud and too close to be anything but deliberate. I spun around, my eyes scanning the trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, every instinct screamed that I was not alone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared in the still air. "Is someone there?" No response came, but as I stood there, straining my ears, I could have sworn I heard the soft sound of breathing, just on the edge of audibility. Fear giving way to a surge of adrenaline, I picked up my pace, no longer stopping to enjoy the scenery. My only goal now was to finish the loop and get back to my car as quickly as possible. But with each bend in the trail, each climb and descent, the feeling of being pursued intensified. More sounds followed, the rustle of leaves, the scrape of something against tree bark, footsteps that seemed to echo my own, but were just slightly out of sync. Once, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape darting between trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, my fear grew to near panic. I was moving as fast as I safely could on the rough terrain, but it didn't seem to matter. Whatever was out there, it was keeping pace effortlessly. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, curious but shy. Maybe it was another hiker playing some kind of sick game. But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in this world of sunlight and solid things. About 3 miles from the trailhead, I rounded a sharp bend and came face to face with something. For a split second, I saw it clearly. A figure, vaguely human in shape, but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible ways. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and ripple like smoke given form. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, featureless except for 2 deep, black pits where eyes should be, radiating a hunger that was ancient and inhuman. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat before I could stop it. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the trail, simply trying to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that mad dash through the woods. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down, because all the while I could hear it behind me. Not running, not crashing through the underbrush as I was, but moving with a terrible, fluid grace that allowed it to keep pace no matter how fast I fled. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, when my legs were about to give out and my heart felt like it would burst from my chest, I broke through the tree line into the parking lot. My car sat there, a beautiful, mundane beacon of safety in the gathering dusk. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys, nearly dropping them in my haste. As I finally managed to unlock the door and all but threw myself inside, I allowed myself one final glance back at the forest. There, just inside the tree line, it stood, no longer trying to hide, no longer darting from shadow to shadow. It stood motionless, those black pit eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my soul shrivel. As I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, I saw it raise one impossibly long arm, fingers unfurling in what almost seemed like a wave goodbye. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest far behind me and the comforting lights of the nearest town surrounding me. Only then did I pull over, my whole body shaking with delayed shock and exhaustion. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I reported it to the park rangers, but they found nothing out of the ordinary on the trail. No strange footprints, no signs of anything unusual. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination, perhaps brought on by dehydration or fatigue. But I know what I saw. I know what chased me through those woods. And I know that it's still out there, waiting. I don't go hiking anymore, at least not alone. The thought of being in the wilderness, isolated and vulnerable, fills me with a primal dread I can't shake. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear something moving out there. Something with two long limbs and eyes like black holes, hungry and patient. And I wonder, with a chill that settles deep in my bones, if it followed me home that day, if it's been out there all along, waiting for the right moment to finish what it started in those remote woods. Because now I know that the monsters aren't just in our imagination. They're real, and they're watching, always watching, from just beyond the edges of our safe, familiar world. And sometimes, if we stray too far from the path, they decide to reach out and touch us, to remind us that we are not the apex predators we believe ourselves to be. So if you find yourself alone in the woods, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Run as fast and as far as you can, because you never know what might be lurking just out of sight, waiting for its chance to pounce. And if you hear a twig snap behind you, well, just pray you're faster than whatever's doing the chasing. The first time I caught my neighbor peering through our living room window, I brushed it off as innocent curiosity. By the third time, I knew something was terribly wrong in this picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. Little did I know, I had unwittingly moved my family into the heart of a nightmare that would challenge everything we thought we knew about community, trust, and the darkness that can lurk behind white picket fences. We'd been looking for a fresh start, Sarah and I. After years of struggling in the city, juggling demanding careers with raising our two kids, we decided it was time for a change. The opportunity came in the form of a job offer for me in a smaller town, promising a better work-life balance and a chance to raise our children in a real community. The house we found seemed perfect, a charming 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac, complete with a spacious backyard and that white picket fence I'd always secretly wanted. The neighbors all seemed friendly enough during our first week, bringing over welcome baskets and inviting us to block parties. But then the watching started. At first, it was subtle. I'd be mowing the lawn and notice Mrs. Johnson across the street, ostensibly watering her flowers, but her eyes fixed firmly on me. Or I'd be playing with the kids in the backyard and catch a glimpse of Mr. Peterson next door, his face quickly disappearing from his upstairs window. I mentioned it to Sarah, but she laughed it off. "They're probably just curious about the new neighbors," she said. "It'll die down once the novelty wears off." But it didn't die down. If anything, it intensified. One evening, as I was settling in to watch TV, movement outside caught my eye. There, pressed against our living room window, was the face of Bob from 2 doors down. When he saw me looking, he didn't even have the decency to appear embarrassed. He just smiled, waved, and walked away as if this was perfectly normal behavior. That was when I knew something was very, very wrong in our new neighborhood. I started paying closer attention, and the more I looked, the more I saw. The neighbors weren't just watching us, they were watching each other too. Every house seemed to have at least one person constantly on surveillance duty, peeking through curtains or finding excuses to be outside at all hours. When I tried to bring it up with Sarah again, she got defensive. "You're being paranoid," she snapped. "This is a nice neighborhood. Stop trying to find problems where there aren't any." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something sinister. I started documenting the watching, keeping a log of who I saw and when. As the weeks went by, patterns emerged. The watching seemed to intensify around certain houses at certain times, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd hear car doors slamming and engines starting up, only to look out and see nothing unusual. Things came to a head about 2 months after we moved in. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the garage tinkering with my car when I heard a commotion from down the street. Curious, I stepped out to see what was going on. A moving truck was parked in front of the Miller's house, and the family was hurriedly loading boxes and furniture. This was odd. The Millers had been nothing but friendly since we arrived, always quick with a wave and a smile. Now, they looked terrified, casting furtive glances around as they worked. I started to walk over, intending to ask if they needed help, but before I could take more than a few steps, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Bob, the window peeper from a few weeks back. "Best not to get involved," he said, his grip uncomfortably tight. "The Millers are leaving. It's better this way." I pulled my arm free, disturbed by his tone and the implication of his words. "What do you mean, Wade, better this way? What's going on here?" Bob's friendly demeanor dropped for a moment, and I saw something cold and hard in his eyes. "Listen, you're new here, so I'll give you some advice. Mind your own business, keep your head down, and everything will be fine. Start asking questions and, well..." He glanced meaningfully at the Millers, who were now pulling out of their driveway, the moving truck following close behind. I watched them go, a chill running down my spine. As I looked around, I realized the entire neighborhood was out, watching the departure, and on every face was the same expression, a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house, checking and rechecking the locks, peeking out windows to see if anyone was watching. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. Car engines, multiple ones, starting up and then quickly fading into the distance. I rushed to the window just in time to see a convoy of vehicles turning out of our cul-de-sac. In the moonlight, I could make out several of our neighbors, cars, all driving in perfect formation. The next morning, the Miller's house stood empty, a "for sale" sign already planted in the front yard. When I asked around, everyone had the same story. The Millers had gotten a sudden job opportunity and had to move immediately. But their eyes told a different story, one of secrets and unspoken threats. I knew then that I had to get to the bottom of this, for my family's sake. I started digging, researching the neighborhood's history, reaching out to former residents. What I uncovered was disturbing. Over the past decade, there had been a string of families who had moved in and then abruptly left, always under mysterious circumstances. Those who stayed spoke of a community watch program that went far beyond looking out for burglars. They hinted at a group that controlled every aspect of life in the neighborhood, deciding who could stay, and who had to go. But it went deeper than that. I found whispers of rituals performed in basements, of sacrifices made to ensure the community's prosperity. Some spoke of a presence that lived beneath the perfectly manicured lawns, something ancient and hungry that demanded tribute. As I delved deeper into these dark secrets, I noticed the watching intensify. No matter where I went or what time of day it was, there was always someone observing me. Cars would follow me to and from work. Strange symbols started appearing on our doorstep, drawn in chalk or carved into the wood. Sarah finally started to believe me when she found a hidden camera in our bedroom. The kids began having nightmares about the smiling people who watch from the shadows. We knew we had to leave, but it wasn't that simple. Our finances were mysteriously drained, our car repeatedly vandalized. Every attempt to put the house on the market was sabotaged. It was clear. The neighborhood didn't want us to leave, at least not on our own terms. It all came to a head one night when we woke to find our entire house surrounded. Every neighbor we had met stood in a circle around our property, holding candles and chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Bob stood at the front, that same cold smile on his face. "It's time for you to make a choice," he called out. "Become one of us truly, or face the consequences. The community has decided." In that moment, looking out at the sea of familiar faces turned sinister in the candlelight, I realized the true horror of our situation. We hadn't just moved into a neighborhood with a dark secret. We had stumbled into a trap, a carefully constructed facade hiding an evil so profound it defied comprehension. The choice before us was clear: submit to whatever twisted ideology controlled this place, or face a fate like the Millers and countless others before them. As I held Sarah close, our terrified children clinging to us, I knew that either way, our lives as we knew them were over. Because the real monster wasn't any one person, or even the shadowy organization that seemed to control everything. The real monster was the idea that evil could hide so effectively in plain sight, that an entire community could be complicit in horrors beyond imagination, all while maintaining a veneer of suburban normality. As Bob and the others began to advance, their chanting growing louder, I realized that our nightmare was only beginning. And I wondered how many other unsuspecting families, in how many other seemingly idyllic neighborhoods, were facing the same terrifying revelation. The true horror, I realized, wasn't what lurked in the shadows. It was what thrived in the light, hiding behind friendly smiles and manicured lawns, waiting to draw in the next unsuspecting victims. The rhythmic crunch of footsteps circling my tent jolted me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. As I lay there, frozen in fear, I realized with growing horror that I was no longer alone in this vast wilderness. The peaceful solitude I had sought had transformed into a nightmarish trap, and I was about to discover just how vulnerable one can be when miles from civilization. I had embarked on this solo camping trip as a way to clear my head and reconnect with nature. After months of grinding through a high-stress job in the city, the idea of spending a week alone in the mountains seemed like the perfect antidote to my burnout. I had chosen a remote area, far off the usual tourist trails, wanting to immerse myself fully in the wilderness experience. The first few days had been everything I'd hoped for. I hiked through pristine forests, sat by crystal-clear mountain streams, and watched breathtaking sunsets from rocky outcrops. The solitude was liberating, the silence broken only by the rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. On the fourth night, I set up camp in a small clearing, nestled between towering pines. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and sat watching the flames dance, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The stars came out, impossibly bright and numerous in the clear mountain air. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face, looking forward to what the next day would bring. But now, as those footsteps circled my tent, that peace was shattered. I held my breath, straining my ears to catch any clue about what was out there. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate to be an animal. This was something or someone else. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, right outside the entrance to my tent. I could hear breathing now, slow and measured. A shadow fell across the fabric, the silhouette of a figure looming over me. "I know you're awake in there," a voice called out, low and gravelly. "Why don't you come on out so we can have a little chat?" My mind raced. Who was this person? How had they found me so far from any marked trails? And more importantly, what did they want? With shaking hands, I reached for the flashlight I kept next to my sleeping bag. Its weight was reassuring, both as a source of light and as a potential weapon if things went south. "I'm armed," I lied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I don't want any trouble." A chuckle came from outside, devoid of any real humor. Now, no need for that. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk. It's been so long since I've had any company out here." Against my better judgment, curiosity began to mingle with my fear. I unzipped the tent slowly, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. As the opening widened, I got my first look at my nocturnal visitor. He was an old man, or at least he appeared to be at first glance. Long white hair and a scraggly beard framed a face weathered by years in the wilderness. But his eyes were sharp, alert, with an intensity that belied his aged appearance. "There, that's better," he said, squatting down to peer into the tent. "Name's Jeb. I live up in these parts." "I didn't think anyone lived out here," I replied, still wary, but slightly less terrified. "The ranger station said this area was uninhabited." Jeb's face twisted into a grimace. "Those rangers don't know half of what goes on in these mountains. There's things out here they couldn't begin to understand." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "What kind of things?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Ancient things. Things that were here long before us and will be here long after. Things that don't take kindly to visitors." I wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a mountain hermit, but something in his tone, in the earnestness of his gaze, made me pause. "Is that why you're here? To warn me?" Jeb nodded solemnly. "Partly, but also to ask for your help. You see, I've been out here for decades, keeping watch, trying to keep people safe, but I'm getting old and I need someone to take up the mantle." Before I could respond, a sound from the forest made us both freeze. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The very air around us seemed to vibrate with it. Jeb's eyes widened in fear. "They're coming. We need to move now." Without waiting for my response, he grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the tent. I barely had time to slip on my boots before he was dragging me into the forest, away from the clearing. As we ran, the humming grew louder. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The clearing was filled with a pulsing, otherworldly light. And in that light, I saw shapes moving, twisted, impossible shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. We ran for what felt like hours, crashing through underbrush, scrambling over rocks, all the while with that unearthly humming growing louder behind us. Finally, we reached a small cave hidden behind a waterfall. Jeb pulled me inside, and for the first time since we started running, we stopped to catch our breath. "What? What were those things?" I gasped, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen. Jeb's face was grim in the dim light filtering through the waterfall. "They have many names. The old ones, the watchers, the hungry ones. They've been here since before humans walked the earth, sleeping in the deep places. But lately, they've been waking up more often, hungry for something only they understand." As the night wore on, Jeb told me more about how he'd stumbled upon their existence decades ago, much like I had. How he'd dedicated his life to understanding them, to finding ways to keep them dormant, and how, as he grew older, He feared what would happen when there was no one left to stand guard. By the time dawn broke, my world had been turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about reality, about the history of our world, had been challenged, and I was faced with a choice: go back to my old life and try to forget what I'd seen, or stay and take up Jeb's mission. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. How could I go back to my mundane office job knowing what lurked in the wilderness? How could I live with myself if I walked away and left others to stumble unknowingly into danger? That was 5 years ago. I've been in these mountains ever since, learning from Jeb, taking over as he grew too old to keep up the vigil. It's a lonely life and a dangerous one, but every time I manage to divert a hiker from a danger zone, every time I feel the ground tremble with the stirring of something ancient and go to investigate, I know I'm where I need to be. Because the truth is, the world is far stranger and more terrifying than most people realize. There are things out there in the wilderness, ancient and powerful things, that defy our understanding of reality. And sometimes, all that stands between them and the unsuspecting world is a lone figure in the wilderness, keeping watch in the night. So if you're ever hiking in remote mountains, and you come across an old man or a not-so-old woman warning you away from certain areas, listen to them. They might just be saving your life and your sanity, because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some nights, the things that go bump in the dark are far more terrifying than anything you could have imagined. The moment I turned away, she was gone. 1 second, my daughter Emily was laughing on the swings, her yellow jacket a bright spot in the gray afternoon. The next, she had vanished into thin air. In that instant, my world shattered, and I was plunged into a nightmare that would consume every waking moment for years to come. It was supposed to be a simple trip to the park, a chance for Emily to burn off some energy before dinner. We'd done it 100 times before. The park was always busy, full of families and children, a safe haven in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I never imagined it could be the setting for the worst day of my life. Emily had been begging to go on the swings, her favorite part of the playground. I helped her get settled, gave her a few pushes to get her started, then stepped back to watch her pump her legs, giggling with each arc higher into the sky. I remember thinking how big she was getting, how independent at just 5 years old. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my wife, asking when we'd be home. I looked down for just a moment, maybe 2, to type a quick reply. When I looked up, the swing was empty, swaying gently in the breeze. At first, I wasn't worried. Emily was adventurous. She probably just hopped off to go to the slide or the monkey bars. I scanned the playground, expecting to see her yellow jacket among the other children, but she wasn't there. "Emily!" I called out, my voice casual at first, then growing more urgent as I received no response. "Emily, where are you?" I started moving through the playground, checking behind every structure, peering into every tunnel. With each passing second, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Other parents began to notice my frantic search, asking if they could help. "My daughter," I explained, my voice shaking. "She was just here on the swings. She's wearing a yellow jacket. Has anyone seen her?" Heads shook. No one had seen a little girl in a yellow jacket leave the playground. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. The next few hours passed in a blur. Someone called the police. The park was cordoned off, searched inch by inch. Dogs were brought in to try and pick up her scent. My wife arrived, her face pale with shock and fear. We were questioned, gently but thoroughly, about any enemies we might have, any reason someone would want to take our child. As night fell, and the search expanded beyond the park, into the surrounding neighborhoods, the terrible reality began to sink in. Emily was gone, taken by someone in broad daylight, from a crowded park, in the few seconds I had looked away. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Our home became a command center for the search efforts. Posters with Emily's smiling face were plastered across town. Volunteers combed every inch of the area. The local news ran stories nightly, pleading for information. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, hope began to fade. The police, while sympathetic, had no leads. The media coverage dwindled. Life, for everyone else, began to move on. But not for us. Not for me. Every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of Emily. Where was she? Was she safe? Was she even still alive? The guilt ate at me constantly. If only I hadn't looked at my phone. If only I'd been more vigilant. If only. My marriage crumbled under the weight of our grief and mutual blame. My wife couldn't bear to look at me, the man who had lost our daughter. I couldn't blame her. I could barely stand to look at myself in the mirror. I threw myself into the search, refusing to give up, even as others told me it was time to accept the unacceptable. I quit my job, spent every penny we had on private investigators, chased down every lead, no matter how unlikely. It was during one of these desperate pursuits of a lead that I encountered him. I was at the park, the same park where Emily had vanished, following up on a tip that someone had seen a girl matching her description. It was a long shot. We'd had dozens of such tips over the years and all leading nowhere, but I had to check. As I stood there, lost in memories and despair, a man approached me. He was ordinary-looking, middle-aged, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "You're Emily's father, aren't you?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, used to being recognized. Our story had been news for so long. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he continued. "It's a terrible thing, to lose a child." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. There was a knowing look in his eyes, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. Did you lose someone too?" I asked hesitantly. He nodded slowly. "My son, many years ago. He was taken, just like your Emily." My heart clenched. Here was someone who truly understood my pain. "Did you ever find out what happened?" The man's expression changed, became more intense. "I did. But the truth was almost worse than not knowing." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are things in this world, forces at work, that most people can't even begin to comprehend. Your Emily, my son, they were taken for a reason." I felt a chill run down my spine. Part of me wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a grief-stricken father, but something held me back. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was intuition, but I found myself hanging on his every word. "What do you mean?" I asked. "What forces?" He glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then said, "Not here. It's not safe to talk openly. But if you want to know the truth, if you're ready to face what really happened to Emily, meet me here tonight at midnight." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of park-goers. I spent the rest of the day in turmoil. The rational part of my mind said this was crazy, that I was grasping at straws. But the part of me that had lived with this pain, this uncertainty for years, couldn't let it go. What if he really did know something? As midnight approached, I found myself back at the park. It was deserted now, the playground equipment casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. I waited, my heart pounding, half expecting the man not to show up. But he did. He emerged from the darkness, his face grave. "You came," he said simply. "That means you're ready to learn the truth. But I warn you, once you know, there's no going back. Your world will never be the same." I took a deep breath. I need to know what happened to my daughter, whatever the cost. He nodded, then began to speak. He told me of ancient rituals, of beings that existed beyond our reality, of sacrifices made to keep the balance between worlds. He spoke of a group, hidden in the shadows of society, that facilitated these sacrifices. Children, he said, were particularly valuable, their innocence a powerful fuel for otherworldly forces. As he talked, I felt my grip on reality slipping. It was insane, impossible, and yet it explained so much. The lack of evidence, the way Emily had vanished without a trace. "You're Emily," he said, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else, something darker. She was chosen, as was my son. They serve a greater purpose now, bridging the gap between worlds. I felt sick, overwhelmed. How do you know all this?" His expression changed, became almost predatory. "Because, my friend, I am one of them. I have been watching you for years, waiting for the right moment, and now, you too have been chosen." As he reached for me, his form seeming to shift and change in the moonlight, I realized the terrible truth. In my desperation to find Emily, I had walked willingly into a trap, and as darkness engulfed me, I understood that my search for my daughter had led me to a fate perhaps worse than hers. The last thing I remember thinking before consciousness slipped away was a desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, Emily was safe, and a final, terrible realization that in this vast, uncaring universe, safety might be nothing more than an illusion we tell ourselves to keep the true horrors at bay.